Welcome to Paper Cuts, folks. Last week we started our story about a young man who was learning about, I think, splitting the atom, and then someone disappeared in a vat of, no, not a vat of not a vat of black oil, a pillar of purple fire, to which the locals were like, there's a ghost. And then someone thinks it's their dad. So things are going down. So anyway, let's hop right into Chapter 2. Old Friends and Foes. Jim must have lapsed into unconsciousness, for when he opened his eyes there was a gap in his consciousness of the passage of time, though none in his memory. He opened his eyes, and instantly he remembered everything. Only a brief interval could have elapsed, for it was not quite dark. The fog and violet flame had cleared away, and overhead a few stars twinkled. Jim was lying on his side, half buried in the black, slimy mud of the dried-up pool. There was nothing but the smooth, shelving mud basin, with the scrub oak surrounding it. Toad and the machine had vanished. Jim pulled himself with an effort out of the sticking mud, and, heavily clogged with it, began to make his way toward the margin. Stumbling, struggling through the viscid ooze, he shouted Lucille's name despairingly. But no answer came, and his cries only made the utter silence. All about him seemed more fearsome. Exhausted by his efforts, he gained the edge of the pool at last and stopped, trying to orientate himself. As he did so, he saw a human face peering at him out of a clump of scrub oak. It was the face of an aged man, with a long white beard and rags of clothes that were festooned about him. Jim took a step toward it, shouting a challenge. Next moment it had hurled itself out of its shelter toward him, and two skeleton-like arms were twined about his shoulders, while the fingers worked upward toward his throat. The face was that of a madman crazed by fear, and Jim recognized it. It was the face of Professor Parrish. Parrish, the trim, immaculate, clean-shaven, urbane old man whose lectures, imbued with wit and scholarship, had always been the delight of his classes. Parrish reduced to this gibbering maniac? And yet Parrish himself returned to the site of their experiments after 5 years. So fierce was the old man's onset, so desperate to his clutch, that for a half minute or more, Jim was reduced to fighting for his life. The clawing fingers, armed with long nails, furrowed Jim's throat, and there was a terrific strength in the body, wasted though it was almost to a skeleton. But it was only for a half-minute that the old Parrish's endurance lasted. Suddenly the old man went limp and tottered forward, dropped upon the ground. Jim bent over him. "Parrish, you know me, I'm Jim Dent. I came here to save you." Parrish was muttering something, and Jim caught the words Toad and God help Lucille. "Parrish, I'm Jim Dent." Jim cried again, and the old man, shuddering, opened his eyes and recognized him. Jim Dent? Then where is she? I got away from that devil, found the farmhouse empty, got the telephone book, found her and phoned her, told her to come to save Lucille. He fell back and his eyes closed. Jim crouched over the unconscious old man, and it was clear that he was in a state of utter perplexity. He couldn't quite gather what Parrish had been trying to tell him, and it was with difficulty that he could focus his mind upon the situation. So great had the shock been of finding his former chief in that condition. What had become of his plane, and where was Lucille? Jim was positive he heard her cry for help out of the vortex in the water. But now there was no water, only a circle of black mud extended in the starlight. Again and again Jim shouted Lucille's name, and his cries went echoing away through the scrub without result. Jim looked down at the unconscious old man beside him. He must get Parrish away, get him to Andy Looms. He bent over him again and raised him in his arms. Suddenly he heard two familiar sounds behind him, two dull thumps that sounded less like explosions than echoes, long drawn out and receding into infinity. There was no other sound quite like them that he'd ever heard. They were the snap of an electrical discharge as the atom smasher began to operate, and why the snap had sounded like a heavy body falling a long distance away was not known. Toad had said one day, with what Jim had taken for sarcasm, that they represented the wave series of a single sound, extended in time to make four-dimensional action, but Jim had never considered the explanation seriously. That sound, bringing back all Jim's memories of their experiments, brought him to his feet sharply. He swung around, and the surface of the pool was a bubbling, seething mass of mud and water, and over its surface the faint violet haze was beginning to spread. In the center, where the light was thickest, something like a gyroscope appeared to be revolving. Out of the gyroscope something was beginning to project, that infernal tube of Lucius Toad. And Jim knew in the heat of the flame that enormous, distorted face of Lucius Toad would again be visible. The human nervous system can only endure a certain amount of impact. The sight of that ghastly flame, already condensing into a violet pillar, was more than Jim could stand. He dragged old Parrish to his feet and started off with him into the thickest part of the undergrowth. A fearful scream behind him stopped him at the very edge of the scrub. He looked back, still supporting the half-conscious old man in his arms. The violet flame was shooting up in a straight pillar. The whole central portion of the pool was dry, and the waters heaped up all around it. From the slightly elevated spot where Jim stood, he could see Toad holding Lucille in his arms in the very heart of the fire, which threw a pale, fluorescent light over their faces. Toad was wearing a spotted skin like that of a leopard, and Lucille was in the blue frock that she'd worn when Jim and she had dinner together 2 evenings before. Jim dropped old Parrish, shouted in answer, and dashed back like a madman, down the slope into the solid wall of water. He fought his way desperately through that wall, which seemed the consistency of soft rubber or treacle, as if some subtle change had taken place in its molecular isomers. It adhered to him without wetting him, and he plunged through it, hearing Lucille cry out again, and yet again. And now he was through, and once more struggling over the viscid surface of the pond. Behind him he heard old Parrish blundering and screeching at the top of his voice, but he paid no attention to him. He could see Lucille more clearly, and the large hazy outlines of Toad's features were beginning to assume the proper proportions. There was a diabolical leer upon Toad's face, unchanged during the 5 years since Jim had seen him last, except that it had become more evil and more powerful. The enormous and distorted face that Jim had seen had simply been due to the presence of some refracting medium. The pillar of violet light was thinning and spreading out over the pool, but Jim could now see the scene more clearly than before, even as he rushed onward. The machine was inside what looked like a flat boat, but more circular than a boat, and apparently made of some aluminum-like metal. Either from the metal hull or from the mechanism inside it, there emitted a pungent odor resembling chlorine. The mechanism itself bore some resemblance to the old atom smasher of 5 years before, but it appeared to be immensely more complicated. Wheels of various sizes were set at every conceivable angle around the central tube from which the violet light was emanating, and all were rotating and gyrating so fast they looked like discs of light. The boat itself was trembling, and this movement appeared to be communicated to the boiling mud in the central part of the pool. As Jim tried to leap down through the sucking mud to snatch Lucille from Toad, the latter stopped, straightened himself, and pointed a short tube at Jim's heart. Jim felt as if an enormous, invisible force had struck him in the chest. It was apparently the same repulsive force that had driven back the waters. The shock was not a violent one. It didn't throw him off his feet. It merely pushed him slowly and irresistibly backward. And then the whole picture was beginning to fade. Etched sharply in the violet light one moment, it now looked like a drawing that had been covered with tissue paper. The outlines were dissolving into a haze, or rather each line seemed reproduced an infinite number of times, as the edge of a vibrating saw shows an infinitude of edges. The violet fire was becoming still more diffused, and it hovered over the waters, a pale, flickering glow. Simultaneously, the walls of water began to break and come surging forward. Jim saw Lucille stretching her arms out toward him, and tried to struggle forward, but his efforts were in vain. She cried out his name, and he put all his strength into that desperate, futile struggle to reach her. But he was being borne backward by the invisible power in the tube. The rushing torrent was surging about his knees, and it grew waist deep. In another moment, Jim was swimming for his life against the furious flood. Suddenly, however, the tremendous pressure on his chest was relaxed. Toad had turned the tube away from him. He was leaning forward out of the boat and grasped old Parrish, who had been flung violently against it by the dissolving waters. The same flood carried Jim to the boat's side, and here, however, the flood was only knee-deep, owing to the repulsion still being excised by the violet light, which was glimmering feebly. Jim found his feet and leapt into the craft, after which he grasped Lucille in his arms. He then turned to confront Toad, who had just dragged old Parrish over the side. The three men confronted one another. "Turn that tube on me, and I'll jump into your machinery and bust it," Jim shouted. An ironical expression came on Toad's face. It was clear he still considered himself master of the situation. At the immediate moment, Dent, the lives of all of us depend upon your keeping absolutely still, so do take my advice and sit down. Jim saw Lucille's face, ghastly in the faint violet light that played about it. The girl had fainted. She was lying unconscious, her feet against the circular metal plate that protected the machinery, her head upon the rail that ran around the boat's upper edge. Toad, without waiting for Jim's answer, stepped over the plate and took a seat at a sort of instrument board with control levers and thumb screws that apparently controlled the needles on 4 dials. He touched a button, and instantly the violet light disappeared. And with its vanishing, the waves came surging forward and lapped violently against the hull, as if about to overwhelm the vessel, which seemed immovable. It simply rose higher in the water. Jim understood the cause of this. Those gyroscopes would retain the hull in the same position against anything but a mechanical force strong enough to ruin it. He watched Toad as he sat at the instrument board, which was illuminated by 2 tiny lights of what looked like mercury vapor. His face, handsome and cruel as ever, was tense as he manipulated the thumb screws. Beside him lay Parrish, faintly whimpering. The old man had evidently, abandoned all hope of effecting his escape, or of rescuing his daughter. It was unbearable to have to sit there, knowing that the 3 of them were absolutely at Toad's mercy, and yet there was nothing else to do. Toad looked up with a saturnine smile. It's a delicate operation to blur the present without shooting out 100 years or so in time. But my micrometer's pretty accurate, Dent. Don't move, I caution you. He smiled again. Yes, Dent, time is something like the 4th dimension of space as we believed in the old days, and I've proved it. Jim saw Toad touch the screw that controlled the 4th dial, and instantly it was borne in on him that each of the dials controlled one spatial dimension. This 4th, then, was the time dimension. Could it be true that Toad had solved the practical problem of traveling in time, theoretically implied since the discoveries of Einstein? Had he known, in the old days, that the Atom Smasher might be adapted to this purpose? He had known, in the old days, that the Atom Smasher might be adapted to this purpose, but neither Parrish nor he had dreamed of turning aside from their endeavor to utilize it for the purpose of releasing atomic energy. Thump, thump. The familiar old sound rushing back into memory after all those years, the release of electrical discharge echoing through infinity. The scrub around the pool blurred and was gone. A vast gray panorama extended itself on either side of them. They were traveling in space, and in time as well. Jim no longer doubted, and chilled with horror, he sat there, his arm about Lucille's unconscious form. Chapter 3. Into the Infinite. How long he sat there he didn't know. Minutes or hours seemed all the same to him. Nothing but that gray monochrome of neither light nor darkness, that endless panorama of miles and years blended together into this chaos. But suddenly there came a shout from Toad. The blur ceased and the lights flickered. Again there sounded the two thumps of electrical discharge. The vibrating mechanism grew steady, and above them, out of the grayness, a moon disclosed itself. Then the pinpoints of stars. All about them was an immense sandy waste. "Know where we are, Dent?" Jim wasn't sufficiently master of himself to attempt to answer. "We are on what will be the Russian steppes, some 50,000 years ahead of us in time." That's an interlude. This is an interlude between two ice ages. Observe how pleasantly warm the climate is, for Russia anyway. Unfortunately, the receding glaciers carried off the topsoil, which accounts for the barrenness of the district. But in another century this country will be overgrown with ferns, and inhabited by a mastodon and wild horse, and perhaps a few enterprising Paleolithic hunters, which will come to track them down and destroy them with their stone axes. "I think you're the sort of liar you always were, Toad," answered Jim, but without conviction. Nothing within 1,000 miles of Long Island corresponded to it. "You'll be convinced pretty quickly when you see my specimen. I let him off here on the way to the pool. He's not exactly presentable, and when I got the idea of picking up Lucille and taking her back with me, I thought it best not to let her see him. He didn't want to be let off. Was afraid I wouldn't pick him up again, and I admit it was a matter of pretty careful reckoning. But this is the place, almost to the yard." "Yes, I've done some close reckoning, Dent, but the cleverest part of the business was letting old Parrish think he got away from me. I knew he'd telephone Lucille. You know, I always had the brains of the outfit," he continued, with a smirk of self-satisfaction, and then looked out of the boat. "And here, if I'm not mistaken, comes my specimen." Something was running across the steps toward them. It came nearer and took human form. It was human. A man, but such a man as Jim had never seen before outside the covers of a book, and he recognized the race immediately. It was a Neanderthal man, one of the race that coexisted with the highly developed Cro-Magnons some 30,000 years ago. He was man and not ape, though the face was bestial. There were huge ridges above his eyebrows. If Jim needed conviction, the sight of this gibbering creature, now climbing into the boat and fawning upon Toad, convinced him. Neanderthal man vanished from the scene long before the beginning of recorded history. For a few moments a deathly faintness overcame him. His eyes closed and he felt unconsciousness rushing in upon him like a black cloud. "It's all right, Dent, don't look so scared," came Toad's mocking voice. Jim opened his eyes, shook off the cloud of darkness. And shook off the cloud of darkness with an immense effort. The boat was throbbing violently as the wheels gyrated. The violet light had become a pillar as thick as a man, and shot straight up to a height of 50 feet before it rolled away. Lucille was lying where she had been, her eyes still staring up, unseeing at the stars. Old Parrish was whining and whimpering as he crouched in his place. And at Toad's feet crouched the Neanderthal man, repulsive, bestial, even though hardly formidable, and filling the last vacant spot inside the boat. He was gibbering and mouthing as he fawned upon Toad and pressed his hand up to his hairy face. He continued to crouch and looked up at his master with dog-like eyes. Repulsive and yet man, not ape. Distinctly human, perhaps a little slower, perhaps a little shorter than the Australian Aborigine. The Neanderthal showed his reverence. The human faculty existed in him. "Meet Kane, one of my drill goes. He's a faithful servant. I left him here to wait for me on the return journey. Kane's just my pet name for him because he subsists on the fruit of the earth, don't you, Kane?" The Drilgo grunted and pressed Toad's hand with his repulsive lips, which were fringed with a reddish beard. Suddenly Toad began to laugh. Suddenly Toad began to laugh uproariously. "Feel anything wrong with your head, Dent?" Dent put up his hand and pulled away a quantity of charred hair. His forehead began to itch, and rubbing his fingers across it, he realized that his eyebrows were gone. Toad laughed still louder. You'd have kept your teeth by about 2 seconds grace, Dent, but I shouldn't be surprised if you needed dental attention shortly. What a pity dentists won't be invented for another 40 or 50,000 years. You're the devil. You see, the human body is very resistant to the ray. It almost seems as if there is an organizing principle within it. Even the animal tissues are resistant, although not to the same extent as the human ones. It takes about 21 seconds for the organized human form to be disintegrated, but hair and beaks and claws, being superficial matter, 10 seconds more and you'd have been obliterated. That's just how close your plane was. Yeah, rub your head. Your hair will probably grow back if I decide to let you live. It rather depends upon what impression you make upon Lucille as a bald-headed hero. After all, I didn't invite you to accompany us. It's your own lookout. Jim could find nothing more to say to that. He was discovering more and more that they were all helpless in Toad's hands. "Sit back," snarled Toad suddenly. He gave the Drilgo a push that sent him sprawling to the bottom of the boat. "Dent, your life depends upon your absolute acquiescence to my proposals. I didn't like you particularly in the old days any more than you like me. I thought you were a fool. On the other hand, I've no active reason to hate you at present. It may be that I can use you. Meanwhile, we've got a longish journey before us, 10,000 years more, multiplied by the force power of 2,000 miles. Seems simple. Well, I had to invent the mathematical process for it. Reckon in the gravitational attraction of the planets, and you'll begin to get an idea of the complexity of it. So in vulgar parlance, we're not likely to arrive until morning." He glanced at Lucille, who was still lying unconscious with Jim's arm about her. Then his eyes rose to meet Jim's, and a sneering smile played about his lips. The smile was the acknowledgment of their rivalry for the girl's affections, and it was more than that. It was a challenge. Toad welcomed that rivalry because Jim could see. He meant to keep him alive under conditions of servitude, to demonstrate to Lucille his superiority. Toad turned his thumbscrews, and the two thuds resounded. That second thud was a lot better. Let's try that again. The violet column sank down, the boat vibrated, and the level stretch of land became a blur again. The moon and stars vanished, and once more the four were off on that terrific journey. At first they seemed to be traversing space that was shot through by alternate light and darkness, so at times Jim could see the other occupants of the boat clearly, while at other times there was only Toad visible at the instrument board, with the dark outlines of the Drilgo Kye&I sprawled at his feet. But soon these streaks seemed to come closer and closer together, until the duration of each was only a fraction of a second, and then yet closer until light and darkness blended into a universal gray. These, Jim knew, were the alternations of night and day. They were traveling, incredible as it was, in time as well as in space, though whether backward or forward Jim couldn't know. From the presence of the Neanderthal man, however, Jim was convinced that Toad was taking them back more thousands of years, into the beginnings of humanity, perhaps. What a fearful journey. A madder journey than Jim could have conceived of had he not been a participant of it. He was losing all sense of reality. He hardly conceived he would not awaken in New York, to discover the whole episode had been a dream. Was this Lucille, the girl he loved, with whom he dined in New York only a day or two before, this unconscious form stretched out on the deck of the weird ship that was rushing through eternity? Or rather, it was they who were rushing through space and time upon a stationary ship. What was reality and what was dream, then? Toad called, "Come over here, Dent, I want to talk to you." Jim picked his way over the metal floor of the round boat, came up to Toad and sat behind him, above the sprawling form of the Drilgo Kye&I. "You were a fool to come here, Dent." Toad turned with a malicious smile from his seat at the instrument board. "You didn't have to come. I take it that you're in love with Lucille, you poor imbecile, and still cherish dreams of winning her. We'll take up that matter in due course. Do you think I've been idle through these past years of my exile? I've been too busy to even come back for the woman I was in love with. And do you know what I was doing during that hellish period? Charting courses, Dent. Mapping out all the planetary movements back for uncounted ages, roughly, crudely of course, but the best I was able to. These are difficult seas to navigate, though it may not seem so. You fool, why didn't you come with me in the old days? I told you the atom smasher could be used to travel through time, and you mocked at me like a dreamer. I chose my hour. When everything was ready, I set forth on the most desperate journey ever attempted by man. Talk of Columbus, he had nothing on me. I tell you, Dent, I've been back to the Archaean age, back to the time when nothing but crawling worms moved on the face of the earth. I've been forward to the time with an errant planet that'll disrupt the earth into a shower of lava, and I nearly wrecked the boat, Dent. I've won, Dent. I've solved the problem that gives man immortality. All the epochs that have existed since God first formed. All the epochs that have existed since the God first formed the world are mine to play with. I've seen myself as a holy infant, and as a graybeard. I have made myself immortal because with this machine I can set back the clock of time. I have found a land in which I am worshipped as a god. I've won, Dent, I've won. I've solved the problem that gives man immortality. All the epochs that have existed since God first formed the world are mine to play with. I've seen myself as a puling infant, and as a graybeard I've made myself immortal because with this machine I can set back the clock of time. I've found a land where I'm worshipped as a god. Toad's eyes glittered with maniacal fires, and he went on in the voice of an indescribable triumph. I'm a god there, Dent. Do you want to know where that land is? It's Atlantis, sunk beneath the waves 9,000 years before recorded history opened. It's Atlantis, from which the Cro-Magnons fled in their ships, to land on the coast of Spain and France and become the ancestors of the modern man. In old Atlantis, still not wholly submerged, I have made myself a god. I have mastered the savage Drilgos whom the Atlanteans oppressed. All the spoils of their ruined cities are at my disposal, and I came back to get Lucille, who I never ceased to love. Together, Lucille and I will rule like god and goddess. Join me, Dent. I'm a god in Atlantis, a god, I tell you. The lesser races fear me as a supernatural being. Only the city remains uncaptured, but it is mine wherever I choose to take it. A god. A god. A god. Jim saw now what he hadn't realized before, that Toad had gone insane. It would indeed have been a miracle if he'd been able to retain his sanity under such circumstances that he described. His voice rose into a wild scream. Yes, Toad was mad, and just such a madman as any of the old Roman emperors. Drunk with power, each in his turn the sole ruler of the world. The earth is mine. Before the modern world was dreamed of, before the nations were created, Atlantis was the sole power that held dominion over the scattered tribes of mankind, and she's at my hand whenever I strike. Wealth incalculable, treasures such as man has never since seen, marvels of scientific discovery, flying machines that make ours look foolish, painting grander than those since have been executed. All these things exist in the proud city that will shortly be at my command. I have my Drilgos, the inferior race, to serve me. They worship me because they know I'm a god. Join me, Dent, and taste the joys of being one of the supreme rulers of the world. In spite of his undoubted madness, there was such power in Toad's voice that Jim couldn't help but believe what he'd said. Well, you hesitate to give me your answer, Dent. Lucille and I are engaged to be married, answered Jim, and the words were drawn from his lips almost against his will. We love each other. I'm not going to lie to you and then betray you, Toad. The expression on Toad's face was demoniacal. He snatched up the deadly tube that contained the violet fire and turned it upon Jim. And again Jim felt that repulsive force pushing him back. He gasped for breath and tensed his whole body in supreme resistance while he tried to grapple with Toad in vain. But suddenly Toad dropped the tube, and a roar of laughter broke from his lips. "You fool, I tell you, my God, the one God supreme above all. Do you think you match your puny will against my own? I tell you, Lucille is mine, and forever dead. Whenever we two have reached old age, all that'll be necessary for us to do will turn this screw a hair's breadth back into the past, and we're both young again. By holding this vessel steady in four-dimensional space, I can achieve immortality." Yes, Toad. But you see, that's the one thing you haven't been able to work out yet. The words seemed to come automatically from Jim's lips. It was only after he'd spoken them that he realized they were true. For a moment, Toad glared at him, and then suddenly, with a shriek of insane rage, he leapt from the instrument board and swung the ray tube with all his might. Jim felt the blow descend with stunning force upon his head. He reeled, flung out his arms, and toppled forward, unconscious. Chapter 4. Escape. An intolerably bright light that seemed to sear his eyeballs was the first thing of which Jim had become conscious. Then he became aware of his aching head, a sense of utter lassitude, as if he'd been bruised all over in some machine that had caught him up and held him in its grip for endless eons. At last, despite the pain in his eyes, he managed to get his eyelids open. He tried to struggle to his feet, only to discover that he was firmly bound with what appeared to be tough creepers, pliant as ropes. After the lapse of a few minutes, during which he struggled with receding waves of unconsciousness, he came to a realization of his surroundings. The light that had so distressed him, though the effects were now beginning to pass off, was a pillar of smoke and flame, shooting out of the crater of a volcano, about a mile away across a valley. He was lying in the entrance to a cave, pegged out on his back and bound by the tough creepers to the stakes driven into the ground. Up to the mouth of the cave grew huge tree ferns, cattails, cycads, and such growths as existed in earlier ages in the warm, moist regions of the world. Beneath the level of the cave, a heavy white fog completely shrouded the valley, extending up to within a short distance of the volcano opposite. But on the upper slopes of the volcano, the sunlight played, making its crater a sheen of glassy lava, But on the upper slopes of the volcano, the sunlight played, making its crater a sheen of glassy lava, intolerably bright. Beyond the volcano, Jim could see what looked like an expanse of ocean. He groaned, and at the sound, a creature came shambling forward, carrying what looked like a huge melon in either hand. Jim recognized the Drilgo, Kye&I. Chattering and mumbling, Kye&I placed one of the fruits to Jim's mouth. It was a sort of breadfruit, but he was too nauseated to eat, and so rejected it with disgust. Kye&I offered him the second fruit. It was a hollow gourd, the interior filled with a clear fluid. Jim drank greedily as the Drilgo put it to his lips. The contents were like water, but slightly acid. Jim felt refreshed as he looked about himself. The Drilgo uttered a chattering call, and immediately a host of the men swarmed into the cave. Undoubtedly men, in spite of their... They were men, in fact, undoubtedly men, in spite of the brow ridges and receding foreheads, carrying long spears, consisted of chipped and pointed heads of stone, with holes bored in them, through which long bands of creepers passed, fastening them firmly to the shaft. Chattering and gesticulating, the Drilgos surrounded Jim as he lay helpless on the ground. Their savage faces, rolling eyes, the threatening gestures they made with their spears, convinced Jim that his end was a foregone conclusion. Then suddenly a distant rumbling sound was heard, increasing rapidly in volume. The floor of the cave vibrated. Masses of rock dropped from the walls. The light of the volcano across the valley, was suddenly obscured in an immense cloud of black smoke. The twilight within the cave was succeeded by almost impenetrable darkness. Shrieking in terror, the Drilgos bolted, while Jim lay straining at his ropes, expecting each moment to be crushed by the masses of rock that were falling all about him. And then suddenly a soft whisper came to Jim through the darkness. "Jim, are you safe? Where are you? I can't see you. Speak to me." It was Lucille's voice, and Jim called back, husky and tremulous in the sheer joy that had succeeded his immense anticipation of instant death. Then he felt the girl kneeling at his side and heard her hacking at his bonds. A whole minute passed before the stone knife was able to sever the last of the stout whiz, however. Then Jim was swaying on his feet, and Lucy's arms were about him, and for a few moments their fears were forgotten in the revival and renewal of their love. I heard what that devil said to you last night. He means to kill you with awful tortures. He's away now, or some task or another, but he'll be back any moment. We must get away at once. We three. Dad's in another cave far away, and his guards look like they'd bolted there after the earthquake. The earth was still rumbling and the cavern was still vibrating, but it was clear there was no time to lose. As soon as the quake subsided, the Drilgos would return, and so, led by Lucille, what about Lucille? So there's something about... I'm sorry, this... okay. I think I know where I am. As soon as the quake subsided, the Drilgos would return. And so, guided by Lucille, Jim groped his way through the cavern. The girl called softly at intervals, and then presently Jim heard old Parrish's answering call. Then the old man's form appeared in silhouette against the dark. "I've got Jim. Are you ready?" Yes, I'm ready. Now is our chance. I know a place where we can hide in the thick forest, where the ray of the Atlanteans cannot penetrate the mists. Let's go." Gripping hands, the three started back down toward the point where a faint patch of darkness showed out in the entrance to the where a faint patch of darkness showed out the entrance to the cavern. They were nearing it when another more and violent shock flung them down upon their faces. Huge masses of rock came tumbling down from the roof and sides of the cavern, and again the three seemed to escape by a miracle. Suddenly, a huge shaft of fire shot from the crater opposite, evolving into an inverted cone that made the whole land dazzlingly bright. It pierced the mists in the valley underneath, and by that light Jim could see a great wave of lava streaming down the mountainsides like soup spilled out of a bowl. A gush of black smoke followed, and the light went out. "Now," gasped Parrish, and clinging to one another, the three darted out of the cavern's entrance. Another terrific shock sent them stumbling and reeling and sprawling down the side of the mountain. Jim heard old Parrish wailing, and as his shock subsided, groped his way to his side. "You hurt?" Lucille, she's dead. A big rock crushed her. I wish I was dead too." Jim called Lucille's name frantically, and to his immense relief, he heard her crying frantically out of the darkness. He rushed to her side and held her in his arms. "Where are you hit, darling?" I'm all right. I was stunned for a moment. I can go on now. But alas, despite her assurations, she went limp in Jim's arms, and Jim picked her up and stood irresolute until he heard Parrish shambling toward him over the heavy ground. Say what you think. She's not hurt, I think, only fainted. Which way, Parrish, you lead us? Down the slope, panted Parrish. We'll be there on the ferns in 11. I love when I lose my place in a book. It's everybody's favorite thing. But she went limp in Jim's arms, and Jim picked her up and stood irresolute until he heard Parrish shambling toward him over the heaving ground. She's not hurt, I think, only fainted. Which way, Parrish? You lead us. Down the slope. We'll be in the ferns in a minute. We can hide there for a while until she's able to walk. Help us all, and I was once a professor of physical chemistry at Columbia. The outcry might have seemed comical in other circumstances. As it was, Jim heartily re-echoed old Parrish's sentiments in heart. The last shock was subsiding in faint earth tremors, and the two men plunged down into the heavy fog, which quickly covered them. Jim carrying Lucille in his arms, he felt the ferny undergrowth all about them. The thick bolus of tree ferns emerging out of the mist. We can stop here for a while, crouch down, they'll never find us in this fog, and in a few minutes when the seal is better, we can go. You must tell me where we are and what our chances are. Come on, said Jim, after again ascertaining that Lucille was unharmed. I'll tell you, Dent, as quick as I can. It's the place where I've spent 5 years of hell. It's the slave of that devil Toad. I never dreamed when we were working on the old Atom Smasher that he'd adapted it to travel in the fourth dimension. He's taking us back 12,000 years ago or so to the island of Atlantis. History hasn't begun yet. Atlantis is the only civilization in the world. The rest are Drilgo's Neanderthal men, wandering in the forests, and still in their Stone Age. It's true, Dent, what old Plato learned from the Egyptian priests. Atlantis has been slowly sinking for thousands of years, and all that's left now is the one great island that we're on. Nearly all the Atlanteans, the Cro-Magnon men, have perished, except for a few who have crossed in ships to the coasts of France and Spain. They will be the founders of modern Europe. Basques and Iberians, and Bretons and Welshmen, our ancestors. It makes my brain reel to think of it. Go on, said Jim with some trouble. There's a great city on the island known as Atlantis, as big as London or New York, with flying machines and temples and art galleries. And big ships that they're building to carry them when they... There's a great city on the island known as Atlantis, too, as big as London or New York, with flying machines and temples and art galleries and big ships. They're building to carry them away when the new substance comes. They knew they're doomed for every few days, whether there's eruption or not. Toto means to make himself master of Atlantis and transfer and means to make himself a master of Atlantis and transport it into another epoch by the means of the Atom Smasher, but he's never managed to enter Adam. He's made himself a god in the eyes of the Durangos. Toad means to make himself master of Atlantis and transport it into another epoch by means of the Atom Smasher, but he's never managed the Atom Smasher. But he's never managed to either. He made himself a god in this. So sorry, I think I may have dozed off a little. He's made himself a god in the eyes of the Drillgos, the savages who inhabit these forests. He's planning to lead them against the city, and he's got an army of thousands from all parts of the interior who worship him as a divine. The Atlanteans themselves, however, were unwarlike. They've forgotten how to fight in their thousands of years of peace. But they've got a raid 10 times strong as Toad's. That brings instant death to everything it touches. It shrivels it up. It's a much different principle. I don't understand it, but it's this ray that keeps the Drillgos from capturing the city. Oh. Toad's got a laboratory inside the cave, fitted up with apparatus he bought from Chicago, the world capital of the year 3000 AD, after disintegrating the atoms and recombining them. But he hasn't succeeded altogether. He hasn't learned anything. The future isn't quite clear like the past. There's a dark cloud that moves across the spectral lines and blurs them. I think it's the element of free will. I know. He can't hold that boat steady in 4-dimensional space as he pretends he can. If he could, it would mean that man was wholly master of his destiny. He can't, and he never will. There's an unknown quantity. That comes in, Parrish. It's something, and that's what's going to beat him in the end. I've not been as idle as Toad thinks. I know more about the Atom Smasher than he dreams of. He just thinks me an old fool, the remnants of whose brains are useful to him in his laboratory. That's why he's kept me alive so far. He'll find out his mistake. I have something Toad doesn't dream of. Suddenly Parrish's air of intense seriousness vanished. He chuckled and fumbled in his rags. Jim felt a small object like a lever pressed into his hand and then withdrawn. It's Death Dent, the concentrated essence of the destructive principle. It's a lever I fitted into a concealed groove in the Atom Smasher unknown to Toad. This lever has a universal joint and connects with a hidden chamber, and when pulled will catapult the annihilated components of a small quantity of uranium in any direction we desire. The release of the slumbering energy of this uranium will produce an explosion of proportions beyond the wildest dreams of engineers. Perhaps one great enough to throw the Earth out of its orbit. Uranium? Breaking up its components? You mean you can actually do that? Yes, I'm keeping it. For the day when Toad becomes a god. When he's studied the boat in time-space and halted the march of the past, and when he's got Lucille, then, Dent, I'll pull that lever so it'll release the energy straight at Toad and destroy the Atom Smasher, ourselves, and even perhaps the whole Earth. Then he burst into a peal of such wild laughter that Jim realized the old man's wits had been long forgotten. Was it true, that amazing story? It was difficult to know, and yet anything seemed possible in this amazing world into which Jim had suddenly been thrown. The vast pall of smoke cast out by the volcano was beginning to subside. Slowly, a spectral light began to filter through the valley. Through the fog, Jim could see glimpses of the ferny undergrowth, the giant tree ferns and cycads that towered aloft. It was like a picture of the earth when the mastodons, the grass-eaters, and the meat-eaters disputed for its supremacy. Jim bent over Lucille, and he saw her stir, heard her murmur his name. Suddenly, she sat up, fixed her eyes on his, and shuddered. "I'm all right, Jim. Let's go. I can walk now." She staggered to her feet, but Jim put out his hand to support her. But she shook her head. Jim touched old Parrish on the arm, and he started and uttered a wild screech, then seemed to come to himself and rose. But that screech of his was re-echoed from the mountainside above. Other voices took up the echoes, and Lucille clutched at Jim in a frenzy of fear. The Drugos, they're on our trail." Seizing old Parrish by the arm, Jim started to drag him into the recesses of the fern forest, and suddenly the bestial face of a Drilgo appeared. A yell broke from the man's throat. The hairy arm shot back, and Jim saw the stone tip of the long spear poised overhead. He leapt forward, delivering a blow in the man's midriff with all the strength of his right arm. The Drogo grunted and doubled forward, the spear falling from his hand. The heavy head of stone embedded itself in the soft ground, so that the spear remained upright, and as the man collapsed, he yelled at the top of his voice. This way," gibbered old Parrish, suddenly alert. But now the undergrowth all about them was alive with Drilgos. The three dodged and doubled like hunted hares, and high overhead something began to clack with a sound like that made by a woodpecker drilling a tree, but infinitely louder. And out of the void above came Toad's voice, shouting commands to the Drilgos in their own language. Suddenly a column of fire shot up from the volcano, infusing the white mists with a reddish glare. Overhead the three could see Toad. He was flying with a pair of mechanical wings strapped to his shoulders, not more than 200 feet above them. With a shout of triumph he swooped down. In his hand was a small cylinder, about the mouth of which a small phosphorescent violet light was beginning to play. "I've got you, Dent!" he screamed in triumph, hovering above the three while the wings drummed and vibrated till they seemed the mere play of light and shadow about Toad's shoulders. "I'll blast your body and soul to hell. I'll kill her too." The deadly tube was pointing steadily at Lucille's body as Toad hovered 10 feet overhead, perfectly still save for the whirring wings. The three stopped dead, and Toad, with a shout of triumph, began calling the Drilgos, who swarmed forward out of the undergrowth. Huge brown bodies, nude save for their skins of jungle cat or serpent, they emerged, quickly forming a ring about the three prisoners. Toad fluttered to the ground. "Fools, did you think you could escape that way? And as for you, Dent, I'm going to convince you of the reality of four-dimensional space, as you wouldn't have been convinced in the old days. Did you know what I'm going to do with you? I'm going to strip the skin from you with debris, and take you into the anatomical room in Columbia University, and leave you there as an exhibit, Dent." Toad grinned like a madman, but Jim was looking past him at something that had suddenly appeared upon the far horizon. It was a round disk of bluish-white, a disk like the moon, but slightly smaller, a disk that flickered as if it had an eyelid that was being winked repeatedly. Simultaneously, screams broke from the throats of all the Drilgos, and they stampeded. Toad whirled about and saw. With a curse, he leapt into the air and whirred away. Out of that disk a slender, blue-white beam shot suddenly, driving a pathway through the fog and disclosing the dark depths of the valley. The eye!" screeched Parrish. "Down on the ground! Down!" He dropped, and Jim caught Lucille and flung himself headlong with her. To and fro overhead, but only a few feet above them, moved the searchlight, Shrieks broke from the Drilgo's throats as they scattered through the jungle. Everywhere that ray moved, trees and undergrowth simply disappeared. A bunch of Drilgos caught by it were obliterated in an instant. Great gaps were left through the undergrowth as the ray passed. It faded as quickly as it had come, and instantly old Parrish was now on his feet, dragging at his daughter. Now, he babbled, heading along one of the burned tracks through the undergrowth. Jim seized Lucille, and the two raced in the wake of old Parrish. Behind them they could hear the Drilgos shouting, but a dense, impenetrable darkness was already beginning to settle over the valley. They lost the track and went crashing through the ferns, on and on and on, until all was silence about them. Suddenly Parrish went down like a log. He lay, breathing heavily, completely exhausted. When Jim spoke to him, a feeble muttering was the only answer. Jim and Lucille dropped to the ground, exhausted, beside him. Alright, I'm going to take this opportunity to take a real short break. We will be right back. I'd suggest you all get up, maybe get a snack, stretch your legs, that sort of thing. And we'll be back with Chapter 5. But anyway, let us return to Chapter 5 now that everyone's gotten their movement in. Oh, really should have cracked my back and other assorted joints before we restarted, because I know some people are not fans of that, but oh well. For perhaps half an hour the three lay there, hearing nothing. It seemed to be night, for the darkness was impenetrable, save for the lurid flashes of fire from the volcano. Parrish, who was slowly recovering his strength, was mumbling incessantly. It was with difficulty that Jim recalled him to a realization of his surroundings. Where's the city of Atlantis?
Over there, behind the volcano. Why do you ask me?
I'm thinking of going there.
Going there? You're mad. The eye will see you. The eye can see for 100 miles. They'll turn the ray on you. Nothing's too small for the eye. They watch all night and day.
The eye's off now, though.
It's never off. The eye's dark. It grows white only when they are about to use the ray. Perhaps the eye is watching us now.
Nevertheless, I think we would do well to try and enter the city. We can't very well live here in the jungle at the mercy of these Drilgos.
It's impossible to enter. All strangers are killed by the Atlanteans.
Dad, I think we'd better do what Jim suggests. One of us must decide.
My idea is that you take us to some place where we can get a view of the city. This isn't the old guy talking. Never mind.
My idea is that you take us to some place where we can get a view of the city. Then we can make up our minds what to do. We've got to get somewhere out of this jungle. Parrish rose to his feet, mumbling.
If we go round the base of the volcano, we can see Atlantis. It's always light there. In daytime, they drive away the fogs by some means they've got, and at night they have an artificial sun. But we'll be killed. We'll all be killed.
Mumbling and muttering, he began groping his way through the undergrowth in the direction of the volcano, whose flashes were becoming again more frequent, affording a means of directing their route. Obscure rumblings were again beginning to shake the earth. For an hour the three picked their way steadily upward through the ferns until the ground became more open. They were approaching the base of the volcano, whose side now towered above them, the upper part glassy with vitreous lava. Suddenly Parrish, who was still leading, stopped and began to tremble with fear. Stepping to his side, Jim heard the low muttering of voices not far away, and very cautiously he moved forward through the thin fern scrub until the glow of burning embers caught his sight. He stopped, hearing the voices more distinctly, and again moved forward. 3 Drilgos, huge bestial men, and evidently an outpost, were squatting around the ashes, devouring something with noisy gusto. Softly as Jim had moved, their acute ears had caught the sound of his footsteps. They rose, still holding what they were eating in their hands, and, grasping their stone spears, moved in 3 separate ways toward the edge of the clearing. The man nearest Jim uttered a guttural exclamation, and after sniffling a moment, began to lope in his direction. Suddenly he stopped short, petrified with astonishment and fear at the sight of a man who, instinct told him, was neither Atlantean nor of his own kind. At this Jim leapt, tackling him about the knees, and brought him heavily to the ground. As the Drilgo fell, the spear clattered from his hand, but from his snakeskin girdle he pulled a long, curved knife of chipped obsidian, sharp as a razor. Jim grasped the Drilgo's wrist, but in a moment he saw that he was no match for the creature in strength. Instead, he drew back his right arm and delivered a punch in the solar plexus with all his strength. As the Drilgo's hand grew limp, he snatched away the knife. There was no helping what he did for the 2 others. They were close upon him. A thrust, a slashing blow, and the Drilgo was weltering in his lifeblood. A backward leap, and Jim evaded the flung spear by a hair's breadth. Knife in hand, he leapt forward, and dodging in beneath the long shaft of the weapon, got in a slash that almost cut the Drilgo's body in 2. The 3rd Drilgo, seeing his 2 companions in their death throes, flung away his spear and fled with loud howls into the jungle. Jim stepped back, and Lucille and her father were already almost at his heels. "It's all right. Come this way," he called. And then he led them through the ferny growth in such a manner that they wouldn't see the 2 dead bodies. Nevertheless, he felt that Lucille knew. "Let's see what they're cooking." But again he turned quickly. He couldn't know for sure what flesh that was, roasting and scorching on the embers, and he had no desire to know. It might have been monkey, but... He turned away, and as he did so, Parrish picked up several round objects that were lying a little distance away.
"These are good to eat, a sort of breadfruit. I've lived on it for 5 years,"
he added with a sort of grotesque pathos. They munched the fruit as they proceeded up the mountain, and found it satisfying. Parrish seemed more himself again, though he still muttered at intervals. Lucille clung closely to Jim as they proceeded. They were treading on lava now, vitreous and smooth as glass. It was impossible to proceed further in that direction. They turned their steps around the base in the direction of the sea. After another hour, during which their way was lit by almost continuous lurid flashes from the crater, a patch of illumination, apparently out at sea, began to become visible. A half-hour more, and they were rounding the volcano's base, and suddenly it burst upon them, a stupendous spectacle that drew an exclamation of amazement from Jim's lips. That low, flat background was the sea, whose breakers were faintly audible. Between sea and land ran a narrow, slender causeway, perhaps a mile in length. And beyond that, set on a small island, was the most splendid city that Jim could have imagined. Like New York, very like New York, with its mighty towers, but more symmetrical, sloping upward from the sea, toward a towering rampart at the heart of it, crowned with huge domes and minarets and serpentine ramps and mighty blocks of stones that must have sheltered as many occupants as New York's highest skyscrapers. The whole was snow-white and gleamed softly in an artificial light dispensed from an enormous artificial planet that seemed to hover above the ramparts. "Wow," whispered Jim in awe as he gazed at the great city.
"You cannot cross that causeway. It's death to try. One sweep of the ray will blot out every living thing."
"Hush, listen, something's coming down, something's moving down there." The distant murmur of voices, the indescribable feel of the proximity of the other human beings, told Jim that they were in imminent danger. He glanced about him, and a little overhead was an outcrop of enormous boulders, standing up like a little fortress above the smooth lava. "Get behind there." They turned and ran, slipping and stumbling up the smooth slope. Reaching the boulders, they ensconced themselves hastily behind them. and Jim peered out through a crevice between two of the largest stones. The sound of moving things became audible. Then, as a flash of flame shot from the crater overhead, Jim saw a black human horde creeping like an array of ants around the base of the mountain not far beneath. Just like an army of warrior ants that seemed to flow onward in perfect order. And in the midst of it, a faint violet light began to be visible. Parrish seized Jim's arms, shaking with terror.
"You know what that is, Dent?"
"It's Toad's drill ghost moving for a night attack upon Atlantis. That thing in the middle's the Atom Smasher." It seemed hours before the last of the serried ranks of Drilgos had passed. By the light of the lurid flash from a volcano, Jim could see the column winding toward the causeway. Then all was shrouded in impenetrable darkness, save for the snow-soft city upon the island.
"What are we going to do? I wish I was back in Toad's cave. He gave me food and let me help with his work sometimes. I'll die here. We'll never get away. We'll never get anywhere."
"We're safer here than anywhere else. We'll have to stay until morning or... God, look at that." Out of the ramparts of the city, the round, blue-white disk of the eye had suddenly disclosed itself, and simultaneously a violet flare shot up above the moving host of the Drilgos in the middle of the causeway. Out of the center of the eye that blinding searchlight streamed, and the pillar of violet fire rose up to counter it, clove it in two as man cuts off tentacle of a cuttlefish, and left it groping, helplessly, above the heads of the Drilgos. To and fro wavered the blue-white beam, and like a protective wall the violet column spread and extended, till the air was interlaced with the play of the two colors. Streaks of white shot through the streaks of purple and black. Neutral clouds twirled, swirling in ghost-like forms. It was a scene inconceivably beautiful, but it was impossible to realize what must be happening out there. Men must be dying, withering like stubble in the blue-white flames whenever they caught them. And yet under that play of colors Jim could see the vast host crawling forward on the assault. He held his breath. It was sublime and terrible, and on the result of the conflict depended... What? What difference when all this was recorded, forgotten history, rather? Antedating the written records of the human race. Then of a sudden the blue-white rays were seen to win. They were beating down the violet light. Like living fingers they pierced that protective wall, flinging it back until only the tall central pillar remained. And then for the first time the sound of combat became audible. A groan of despair, of defeat, of hopelessness. The black stream was recoiling, turning upon itself. In the vivid glare of the white light it could be seen dissolving, breaking into 1,000 pieces, streaming back toward the land. And as it broke, the blue-white light pursued, eating its way and blasting all it met. Atlantis had triumphed. Another sound was audible. From the city it came, a whirring as of innumerable grasshoppers, increasing till it sounded once more like the tapping of innumerable woodpeckers. Suddenly the night broke into whirling balls of fire. Lucille cried out, and Jim leapt to his feet to see more clearly. It's men with wings. Scores of them. They're hurling something at the Drilgos. The clacking of the wing mechanism filled the air, and now the fugitives from the Drilgo host were streaming along the base of the mountain underneath, seeking the safety of the jungles. And over them, riding them, harrying them, flew the Atlantean birdmen, hurling their fiery balls. And where the balls fell, conflagrations of cold fire seemed to start and run like mercury and shrivel up everything they touched. But the birdmen were not without casualties of their own. Here and there one could be seen to drop, and then the masked Drilgos would turn savagely upon him with their stone-pointed spears. The fight was coming very close now. The savage cries of the Drilgos filled the night. A ball of fire broke hardly 50 yards away from where the three were crouching. A birdman fluttered down like a wounded hawk and lay asprawl just underneath the rampart of boulders. Jim surmounted them, ran down the slope of the mountainside, and bent over the dying man. He was hideously wounded by the thrust of a Drilgo spear. Whether because the mechanism had failed, or because he'd swooped too low, Jim couldn't determine. As Jim bent over him, he looked up at him. a youth in his teens, with a face and build of a Greek warrior, a worthy ancestor of European man. Jim looked at him and shuddered. My grandfather, 400 generations removed, he thought. Seeing that this was no Drilgo, with eyes widened by the anticipation of depth, the Atlantean smiled and died. Jim detached the straps that held the wings to his shoulders and examined them. They were multi-hinged, built of innumerable layers of laminated wood, which seemed to have been subjected to some special treatment. In the base of each, just where it fitted to the curve of the shoulder blade, a tiny light was burning. Jim looped the straps about his arms and walked back to the rampart. Old Parrish saw him and screamed, and Lucille cried out as well. I'm going to try to get the Atom Smasher, said Jim, pointing to the thin spire of violet flame that was still visible in the center of the causeway. It's our only chance. You must stay here. If I live, I'll return. If I don't return, well... But he knew that he must return. Nothing could kill him, because Lucille would be waiting for him behind the rampart of stones, upon that bare, vitreous mountainside. I'm going to get the Atom Smasher. In these wings I'll be taken for Atlantean. I'll bring it back. He spoke with faltering conviction. And yet there was nothing else to do. Everything depended upon his being able to bring back the Atom Smasher and take Lucille and her father away. I think you're right, Jim. We'll wait here until you come back. Her voice died away in a sob, and Jim bent and kissed her. Then he began examining the mechanism of the wings. It didn't appear difficult. A leather strap fastened about the body. Though this strap ran cords operated by levers upon the breast, and there was a knob in the groove that looked as if it controlled the starting of the mechanism. I'll be back. And suddenly the eye appeared again, and with it there sounded once more the whir of wings. Get down! Shouted Jim. But he was too late. A score of birdmen shot out of the dark and hovered over to them. The next moment they descended to the ground. Lucille and Parrish were seized, and Jim, struggling furiously, quickly found him equally helpless in their grasp. The accents of the Atlanteans as they spoke to one another were soft and liquid. Their faces were refined and gentle, but their strength was that of athletes. Jim saw Lucille and Parrish lifted into the air. The next moment he himself was raised in the arms of one of the birdmen, who shot upward like an arrow and headed a course back to the city, carrying Jim as if he'd been light as a child. Chapter 6. Human Sacrifice. In a great open space, flanked by temples and colonnades, the flight had come to rest. There, under the soft artificial light that made the whole city bright as day, Jim, Lucille, and her father were set down before a sort of rostrum, on which were gathered the dignitaries of the city. Jim's hopes were rising fast, for between the Atlanteans and the savage Drilgos there was much difference, between a modern American and a fellow from the Australian bush. Ooh. Yikes. 1930s, everybody's favorite. These men were civilized to a degree that even modern America had not attained. Nowhere was there a speck of dirt to be seen. Vehicles moved so soundlessly along the wide streets on either side of this central meeting place, and the whole city was roofed with glass, through which could be seen the brilliant moon and stars, invisible from the mist-filled valley without. Soft garments of white wool clothed men and women alike, fashioned something like togas, but cut short at the knee, leaving the lower part of the leg bare and disclosing the sandaled feet. The hair was long and flowed about the shoulders, but what struck Jim most forcibly was the look of utter gentleness and benignity. There we go. Sorry, it took me a minute. I had to brain how to remember to pronounce that word. But anyway, what struck Jim most forcefully was the look of utter gentleness and benignity upon these faces. I guess we've fallen into pretty good hands after all, he whispered to Parrish. But one of the dignitaries upon the platform, an elderly man with a face reminiscent of William Jennings Bryan in his inspired moments, was leaning forward out of his curved chair and addressing the old man, and to Jim's astonishment, Parrish was answering. These weren't the liquid accents of the Atlanteans, however. The words resembled the barking of a dog, and across Jim's brain there suddenly flashed the explanation. The dignitary was speaking in the tongue of the Drilgoes, which Parrish, of course, would have learned in his 5 years of captivity. Suddenly, Parrish turned to Jim.
He wants to know where we've come from. I've told him from a far country. He thinks we're ambassadors from some of the parts of Europe that Atlanteans who sailed away some years ago landed at. It's no use trying to explain. They don't seem to have succeeded in inventing an atom smasher for themselves.
Jim nodded, and the colloquy went on and on, while the Atlanteans listened with languid interest, their kind and smiling faces seeming to exude benignity. At length the session seemed to have ended. Parrish wore a wide grin.
"Everything's coming right, dear," he told Lucille. "The old chap says we are to be the guests of the city either for a night or for a week. It's something to do with the moon, and there seems to be a full moon tonight. Some quaint superstition or other. And then I guess we'll have a chance to get away in the atom smasher. I've learned something of the mechanism. It won't be hard to operate it. We've fallen into good hands."
A squad of four soldiers or policemen, with shorter robes and what looked like truncheons in their hands, made signs to the three to accompany them. Amid mutual bows, the city's guests filed into a small courtway, closed at the further end, on which a number of Atlanteans were standing. While Jim was wondering what the next move was to be, his astonishment at the cold While Jim was wondering what his next move was to be, his astonishment, the whole courtyard began to rise slowly up the walls of the tall buildings on either side. "An elevator! Now I do feel that everything's coming out all right, Jim dear." Jim didn't question the psychology of this. Instead, he just pressed her hand tenderly. Already Toad and the past were becoming no more than a bad dream. "Did you say anything about the atom smasher, Paris?"
"No, I thought it better not to. You see, they know it only as a force that neutralizes the blue-white ray. Best not to let them know we're sailing for home in it."
"I think that was wise," answered Jim, and then just then the rising courtway came to a stop level with the top story of the great building at one side. Smiling courteously, the guards invited the three to precede them inside an enormous hall, supported on pillars of gleaming stone resembling alabaster. In the center was a small, low table, triangular in shape, with the three of the low, curved chairs. The guards invited the three to be seated, and almost immediately smiling servitors brought in fruits on platters of porcelain, dishes of cooked vegetables, somewhat like the modern ones, but seasoned and flavored with delicious herbs. The staple dish was something like an oval banana, but infinitely more succulent. Three fell to and made a hearty meal, which was washed down with fine wines. "We've certainly fallen into good hands. All we've got to do is lie low and look pleasant. It won't be long before we get an opportunity to get hold of the atom smasher." The guards, seeing that they had finished their meal, smilingly invited them to accompany them through a huge bronze door on one end of the hall. It swung back, disclosing complete darkness. Jim felt Lucille's hand upon his arm. The girl was hesitating, and for a moment Jim hesitated too, half afraid of a fall into emptiness. And then he heard the footsteps of the guards ahead and went on. It was eerie moving there with the sound of feet in front of them, and apart from that, utter silence. Then Lucille uttered a little cry. "Jim, do you feel something pushing you?" "There is something." And Jim swung around, but some invisible force continued to propel him forward. He moved sideways, and the force gently corrected him. The sound of footsteps had ceased. What is it, Jim? Help me. Something's got a hold of me. Old Parrish was struggling close beside them. Jim panted as he wrestled with the force, but his efforts were absolutely futile. Slowly, as if slid on wires, he was propelled forward until a cushion of air seemed to block his further progress. Dark as it was and silent, Jim had the consciousness of other human beings about him, of a vast unseen multitude that was watching him. Suddenly the droning of a chant began to fill the place, as if a priest were intoning hymns. As that chant rose and fell, voices all about took up the echoing refrain. Jim tried to reach Lucille, but he could move his arm only a few inches against the resilient force pressing in on all sides of him. Then in an instant, a blinding, stabbing light shot through his eyeballs. He heard Lucille scream, old Parrish yelp, and with eyelids screwed tight against the intolerable glare, fought once more desperately and ineffectively to reach Lucille's side. Slowly, Jim managed to unscrew his eyes. He began to realize that he was standing in what appeared to be an enormous amphitheater, but high up upon a narrow tongue of flooring that ran like a bridge from one end to the other, with Lucille on his right and Parrish on his left. Nothing visible seemed to be restraining them, and yet they were securely held as if fastened with tight chains. Jim's brain reeled as he looked down. Imagine a bridge, halfway up an amphitheater of 100 stories, the ground beneath packed with human beings no larger than ants. The whole of the vast interior lined with them, tier above tier, faces and forms, increasing from prismatic size below to the dimensions of the human form upon a level, and then again fading to almost pinpoints at the summit of the vast building, where the soft glow of the artificial light filtered through the glass of the roof. He clutched at the air, felt the soft pressure of the force that was restraining him, looked at Lucille and saw her half unconscious with fear, leaning against that soft, resilient, cushion-like, invisible substance. Looked at Parrish, whom the shock had thrown into a sort of semi-catalepsy, Parrish mouthing and staring. He looked forward to where the tongue of flooring ended. Here, upon a stage flanked with huge carven figures, a group was gathered. At first he was unable to discern what was being enacted there, so brilliant was the light that glared overhead. But soon he found that it was the Eye, a round disk perhaps 10 feet in diameter, that all-seeing Eye of Atlantis that guarded the great city, but how it worked Jim was totally unable to discover. He saw, however, that it was blinking rapidly, the alternations being so swift that it was only just possible to be conscious of them. Perhaps the Eye was opening and closing 10 times a second or more. Jim strained his eyes to see what was taking place on the stage at the end of the tongue on which he stood. What was it? What were they doing there? Was that the captured Atom Smasher standing between what looked like grinning idols? A group of captured Drilgos near it? A shrill scream from Lucille echoed through the vast amphitheater. Her eye had seen what Jim's had not yet seen, something that shocked her into a complete unconsciousness. A marble figure, she stood leaning against the invisible force that kept her on her feet, and in those open, staring eyes was a look of ineffable horror. Jim could see clearly now, for the light from the Eye was slowly diminishing in brilliancy, or perhaps his own eyes were simply growing more accustomed to it. Those carven figures, forming a semicircle upon the platform, were figures of gods. Squat, huge forms, seeming to emerge out of the blocks of rock from which they'd been fashioned. Hideous, gruesome carvings they were, resembling some futuristic sculpture of today, for the artist who had fashioned them had given hardly more than a hint of the finished representation. It was rather as if the masses of rock that had been transported here had become vitalized, foreshadowing the dim yet awful beings that were to some day emerge from them. Only the arms were clearly sculptured, and each of the half-dozen figures squatting upon its haunches in the semicircle had 4 of them. Arms that protruded so as to form an interlacing network, and the fingers were long claws fashioned of some metal. Over the arms, the shapeless heads beat down with a leering look, and from each mouth protruded a curved tongue. It was a masterpiece of horror, that group, like the great stone figures of the Aztecs, or some of the hideous Indian gods. Seen under the glare of the eye, they formed a background of horrible omen. In a flash, it dawned upon Jim that these hideous figures might be gods of bloody sacrifice. That's why these people seem so gentle. It's the contrast, he stammered, and then tried to pull himself together. Once again, he tried to move toward Lucille, and again the invisible force restrained him. Yes, it was the captured Atom Smasher upon the platform, and those forms grouped in front of the dignitaries were captured Drilgos, a dozen or more of them. And the concealed priest was droning a chant again. Every other sound was hushed, but from each square foot of the great amphitheater, a pair of eyes was watching. A myriad of eyes turned upon the platform. What was going to happen next? Suddenly the priest's voice died away, and simultaneously the three dignitaries, who seemed to be officiating priests from their solemn gestures, stepped backwards, passing beneath the protruding arms of the idols. There sounded the deep whir of some mechanism somewhere, and the same invisible force that had Jim and his two companions in its control suddenly began to agitate the captive Drilgos. It was shuffling them, was forcing them into a line, pushing here and pulling there, in spite of the Drilgos' terrified struggles. They writhed and twisted, groaning and clicking in abject terror as they wrestled with that unseen power, and all in vain. Slowly the foremost of the Drilgos was propelled forward, inch by inch, until he stood immediately beneath the interlacing arms. And what happened next filled Jim with sick horror and loathing, for of a sudden the arms began to move. The iron claws cut through the air. A shriek of terror and anguish broke from the Drilgo's mouth. And then he was no longer a man, but a clawed and pulped mass of human flesh. "Ayah! Ayah! Ayah!" broke from the throats of the assembled multitude. The weaving arms had stopped. From behind them an attendant was gathering up what had been the Drilgo in a basket. And then the mechanism began again, and again that shrill cry of the spectators was ringing in Jim's ears. Louder still rose the shriek of old Parrish as he understood. Jim put forth all his strength in a mad effort to break free, and a child would have had more chance in the grip of a giant. Each time the arms of the gods revolved, the unseen force pushed Jim, Lucille, and Parrish nearer the platform. Now Jim understood. This terrible sacrifice was a part of the religion of the Atlanteans, and he, Lucille, and Parrish were being reserved for the final spectacle. And at the sight of Lucille beside him, stonily unconscious and yet standing and moving like a mechanical doll, in little forward jerks, at the sight of the girl hardly 6 feet distant, and yet utterly beyond the touch of his fingertips, Jim went mad. He wouldn't shout. He closed his lips in the pride of his race, pride of that civilization he'd left 12,000 years ahead of him. Not like the shrieking Drilgos on the platform, howling as each of them in turn was forced into that maze of revolving knives. But he fought as a madman fights. He hammered at the Brazilian air while the sweat ran down his face. He braced his feet against the wooden tongue, and sought to stay his forward progress. And all the while that infernal force moved him steadily onward. He was on the platform now. He was traveling the same route that the Drilgos had taken. The unseen force was shuffling him, Lucille, and Parrish, pushing and pulling them. And despite Jim's effort, it was Lucille who was first of the three, and Jim second, and old Parrish third. Jim heard Parrish's horse whisper behind him, "Death! Death! The uranium!" He was fumbling at his breast, but the significance of the words and gestures escaped him. He was staring ahead. Only 3 living Drilgos of the whole number of prisoners remained alive, and suddenly it was borne in upon Jim that he knew the last of the 3. It was the Drilgo Kye&I who had been their companion in the Atom Smasher, there not a dozen feet distant. Kye&I, his bestial face, with the ridged eyebrows and great jaws convulsed with terror and dripping sweat. Kye immediately in front of Lucille. "Let her not wake. Let her never know," Jim breathed. The agony would be but momentary, and there was nothing a man could not endure if he must. He could even endure to see Lucille become what the Drogos had become. It would be soon over now. The eye was blinking overhead. The hideous stone faces of the Atlantean gods looked down in leering mockery. Another of the Drogos had gone the same route as the others. Kye was the second now, Lucille the third victim, and he, Jim, would be the fourth. Gritting his teeth, Jim saw the next Drogo propelled forward into the whirling knives. He saw the man fling up his arms as if to shield his head, and then he was a man no longer, and the horrible knives revolved, and "Ayah! Ayah! Ayah!" cried the multitude. Once more the mechanism whirred, once more the arms revolved. A howl of terror broke from Kye's lips as he was propelled onward, and then suddenly the whirring stopped. The arms of the stone gods, with their hooked, razor-like claws, to which clung particles of flesh, were arrested in mid-air. Kye, unharmed, was leaning backward, his features set in a mask of awful fear. Simultaneously, Jim knew that the force which had held him in thrall was gone. He flung his arms out. He was free. He grasped Lucille, held her tightly against his chest, and stood there drawing great, labored breaths, waiting for what? A film was creeping over his eyes, but he was aware that the eye had suddenly gone out. And out of the dark, the priest was chanting. Then came a deep-drawn sigh from the spectators, followed by a ringing shout. In place of the eye, the full moon appeared, sailing overhead, and holding off that deadly weakness. Jim understood. The sacrifice had ended. A new month had begun. Chapter 7. Back to Long Island. Jim, seated beside Lucille, was listening to Kye's grunting and chuckling as he expounded the situation to Old Parrish. It was the day following the scene in the amphitheater. The four had been escorted back along the tongue of flooring into a hall with walls of fretted stone and sumptuous colorings. The floor was strewn with rich rugs woven of some vegetable fiber. There were divans and low chairs. At brief intervals, servitors, always smiling, passed carrying trays with wines and foods, and in the corridors were always glimpses of the guards.
It was the rising of the full moon that saved our lives, Dent. It appears they have this sacrifice at each of the moon's phases. The victims, captives, or criminals are eaten by the priests. We've got a week's respite, Dent, and then, well, you know.
Jim's arm tightened about Lucille, but the girl turned and smiled into his face. There was no longer any fear there, and Jim swore to himself that he would yet find some way of outwitting their devilish captors. "What the devil are we supposed to be, criminals or what? Why do they smile at us all the time in that confounded way?" Parrish questioned the Drogo, but apparently he was unable to explain himself to him.
Maybe they think it's an honor for us, Dent, or maybe it's their idea of etiquette. Anyway, we four are to head the list when the moon's at the 3/4. Oh, if only we could reach the Atom Smasher, I'm sure we could find out how it works.
Jim had tried more than once to reach it. Through the colonnades at the end of the hall, he could always see the mechanism standing on the platform, always being inspected by a half-dozen or so of the dignitaries of Atlantis. But all his attempts to cross that tongue of flooring had been vetoed by the guards. They had presented their hands to him, palms outward, and on the palms were fine steel points, about 2 inches long, set into leather gauntlets. It had been impossible to try conclusions with them. 2 days went by. Once a group of dignitaries had entered the hall, and with smiles and profuse bows, inspected the prisoners. and then they had departed, and Jim paced the floor to and fro, thinking desperately. There was no weapon with which to hazard an attack. Jim knew that they were under the closest observation. He could only wait and hope. And if all else failed, he meant to hurl himself, with Lucille in his arms, off the tongue of floor into the depths below, when their time came. On the third morning, after a troubled sleep induced by very weariness, Jim was awakened by one of the guards and started up to see one of the bowing dignitaries before him, and Parrish and Lucille sitting among their rugs. Bowing repeatedly, the smiling old man addressed some words to Jim and then turned to Parrish.
"He says he wants you to show him the way the atom smasher works. Now's our chance, Dent. He thinks it's simply an apparatus for neutralizing the blue-white ray. Don't let him guess."
"I won't let him guess."
"Tell him we'll go and show. I've told him, and he says only you are to go. He's suspicious. Say something quickly, Dent."
"Tell him that I must have my 2 assistants and the lady. Tell him I may also need the help of some of his people. It requires many men to operate the machine." Parrish translated, speaking in the Drilgo tongue, which was their only means of communication. The Atlantean considered, and then spoke again.
"He says that we 3 men may go, but Lucille must be left behind."
The answer is no. The old dignitary, who seemed somewhat crestfallen at this, departed with an expressive gesture. Jim and Parrish looked at each other.
"That's our end."
No, he'll bite," answered Jim, with the first grin that had appeared on his countenance since their arrival. "Let's make our plans quickly. We must contrive to get Lucille inside the machine under the pretense of assisting with the mechanism. And Kye&I, of course," he added, glancing at the goggly-eyed Drilgo. "You do your best to locate the starting mechanism, Parrish. Signal me the moment you're ready. We'll both leap in, and the 4 of us will sail. I don't care where we sail to as long as we get away from here, into eternity if need be, but I hope it's Long Island." Back came the dignitary with 2 of the guards. Smiling at Jim, he indicated by signs that the 3 others might accompany him. The Atlanteans had bitten, as Jim had forecast. The 4 proceeded along the hall and over the tongue of flooring. This time, the force that had previously controlled their movements was not in action. At the farther end of the bridge, they saw the group of dignitaries gathered about the atom smasher, examining it curiously. Over their heads, the hooked arms of the hideous gods were raised. The eye was darkened as if with a curtain, and through the glass roof high overhead, the sunlight streamed down upon the empty amphitheater. In spite of their smiles, the dignitaries of Atlantis were very much on the alert, as their tense attitudes denoted. 2 or more guards had appeared, and Jim saw that they were uncovering some apparatus at the base of the eye. They were swinging a camera-like object toward him, its lens focused upon the atom smasher. It was not difficult to understand what was in the minds of the Atlanteans. The dignitaries were uneasy and mistrustful, and at the first suspicion of treachery, they meant to loose the blue-white ray contained in the apparatus and blow the atom smasher, and the group about it, to destruction. Jim intercepted a sign from Parrish, indicating he was to make pretense of assisting him. He bent over the machine, Lucille beside him. Parrish was busily examining the wheels and levers, and adjusting the thumb screws, moving the needles along the dials. One of the Atlanteans spoke, and Kye translated into Drilgo for Parrish's benefit. Parrish answered, and then without raising his head, the old man said quietly,
I've located the starting lever, Dent. You and Lucille get inside quickly and pretend you're doing something to the machinery.
They stepped over the bow of the boat and stood beside Parrish, who continued examining the wheels. "We mustn't forget Kye. I hope he understands." But there was no direct evidence that Kye did understand, and Parrish dared not warn him in Drilgo for fear one of the Atlanteans might understand the language. Kye was standing close beside the boat, but he wasn't in the boat. Again, one of the Atlanteans shot a question at Parrish, and Parrish beckoned to Kye and awaited the translation. He answered. Each moment was growing tenser. It was impossible that the Atlanteans could fail to understand what was being planned. The only saving chance was that they didn't realize the possibility of escape the vessel offered. A full minute went by. Suddenly Parrish raised his head.
"I've got it fixed, I think, Dent. I'm going to count. When I reach 3, seize Kane and pull him aboard."
Jim nodded. The uneasiness was increasing. The guards of the camera-like object were holding some sort of mechanical accessory in their hands. It looked like a small sphere of glass, and it connected with the apparatus by means of a hollow tube of fiber. Jim guessed that in an instant the ray could be made to dart out of the lens. It'd be quick work, as nearly as possible instantaneous work.
"Ready, Dent?"
asked Parrish in a surprisingly even voice. In this crisis, the old man had become astonishingly calm. He seemed the calmest of the lot.
1.
Jim beckoned to Kane, who came toward him, his eyes goggling in inquiry.
2.
Jim reached out and took Kane by the arm. It was a sharp question from the Atlantean who had spoken before.
3.
With all his force, Jim yanked Kane over the edge of the boat. The Drugo stumbled and fell headlong with a howl of terror, but headlong inside. What happened was practically instantaneous. A sudden whir of the mechanism, a violet glow of the funnel, the smell of chlorine, a flash of blinding blue-white light. The Atlantean guards had fired, but a quarter-second too late. The thump-thump of the electrical discharge died away, and the 4 were in the boat, whirling away through space. Kane was rising to his knees, a woebegone expression on his face, and there was a clean cut, with charred black edges, along one side of the boat, showing how near the Atlanteans had come to success. The relief after the hideous suspense of the past days was almost too much for 3 modern people. "We're free, we're going back home!" cried Jim exultantly as he caught Lucille in his arms, and she surrendered her lips to his, while the tears streamed down her cheeks. Old Parrish at the instrument board looked up, smiling and chuckling. Even Kane, understanding that they were not to be hacked to bits with knives, gurgled and grinned all over his face. "How long will it take us to get back?"
"I'm not quite sure, my boy. You see, I haven't quite familiarized myself with the machine as yet."
"But we'll get back all right?"
"Well, we're headed in the right direction, as far as I can tell. You see, my boy, it's a rather intricate table of logarithmic calculations that scoundrels pasted on this board. The great danger seems to be that coming within the orbit of the giant planet Jupiter. Of course, I'm trying to keep within the planet of the Earth, but there is a danger of being deflected into Pallas, Sirius, or one of the smaller asteroids, and finding ourselves upon a rock in space."
"But you don't have to leave the Earth, do you?" Jim asked, looking at Parrish in consternation.
"Unfortunately, it's pretty hard sticking to the Earth, my lad. You see, Earth has moved a good many million miles through space since the time of Atlantis."
But both Jim and Lucille noticed that Parrish was already speaking of Atlantis as if it was in the past. They drew a hopeful augury from that, and then there was nothing to do but resign themselves to that universal grayness and hope. They noticed Kane seemed to be watching Parrish's movements with unusual interest. The Neanderthal man seemed fascinated by the play of dials, the whir of wheels, and gyroscopes. "Are you setting a course, Dad? I mean, do you know just where we are?"
"To tell you the truth, my dear, I don't. I'm relying on some markings that Toad made on the chart, certain combinations of figures. Heaven only knows where they'll take us to, but I'm hoping that by following them we shall find ourselves back on Long Island in good old 1930. No, that rascal could hardly have written down those figures to no purpose. They seem to comprise a course, both going and returning, but the calculations are very intricate, especially in the time dimension. I've nearly reached the last row now. Then we shall have arrived, or we shan't."
Jim and Lucille sat down again. There was nothing that they could do, but somehow their hopes of reaching Long Island in the year of 1930 had grown exceedingly slim. Everything depended upon whether or not Toad had meant those figures to represent a course back to the starting point, or not. a desperate hope. That was all that remained to them. They watched perish as his eyes wandered among the rows of figures, while his fingers moved the micrometer screws, and then he looked up.
"We are reaching the end of our course. We're going to land somewhere. Heaven only knows it'll be. Well, we must hope. That's all that's left of us."
His hands dropped from the dials, and he pressed a lever. The blur of nights and days began to slow, and a column of vivid violet light shot from the funnel.
"Now grip tight."
Thump, thump. The Atom Smasher was vibrating violently. A jar threw Jim against Lucille. It was coming to a standstill. Trees appeared. Jim uttered a shout. He stepped across to Parrish and wrung his hand. He put his arms about Lucille and kissed her. They were back at the vanishing place, and all their sufferings seemed to be of the past. Chapter 8. A Fruitless Journey.
Why don't you stop the boat, Parrish? I'm trying to, lad."
The Atom Smasher was still vibrating, even more violently than before. Excuse me. A column of violet light was pouring from her funnel. The pool of mud, the walls of heaped-up water were discernible, but all quivering and reproduced line after line to infinity. It was like looking into the rear-view mirror of a car that's vibrating rapidly. It was like one of those cubist paintings of a woman descending the stairs where one had to puzzle out which is the woman and which is the stairs. A dreadful thought shot through Jim's mind. He remembered what he said to Toad. You can't hold the boat still in four-dimensional space. This wasn't quite the same. By stopping the infernal mechanism, one re-entered three-dimensional space and landed. Certainly the Atom Smasher could land. They weren't like a motorcyclist who got on the machine for the first time and rode to the admiration of all who saw him, except he couldn't figure out how to stop. And yet there was Parrish still fumbling with the controls, and the boat was still vibrating at a terrific rate of speed. It was impossible to dream of leaping out. There was no solidity, no continuity in the scenery outside. It was not like attempting to leap from a moving train, for instance. In that case, one knows there's solid earth beneath, however hard one lands. Here everything was distorted, a sort of mirror reflection. And Jim noticed a strange thing that had never occurred to him before. Everything was reversed as in a mirrored picture. That clump of trees, for instance, which should have been on the right, was on the left.
"There's some means of stopping her, of course. There must be a lever, but I don't know where to look for it in all this mess."
He pointed to the revolving wheels. No, it might be a matter of days of experimenting in order to uncover the elusive switch.
"It may be a combination of switches. I don't know what we're going to do."
Suppose I jumped and chanced it. Lucille caught his arm with a little cry, and Parrish shook his head. That devil.
"That devil, listen, there was a Drillgo he disliked. He threw him out of the boat just before we landed at the cave. Everything was in plain sight, plainer than things are here. But he was never seen again. For goodness sake, lad, sit still, I'll try."
And yet hours later, Parrish was still trying. And gradually, Jim and Lucille had ceased to hope. Side by side they'd sat, watching that glimmering scene about them. Sometimes everything receded into a blur, across which sunlight and shadow and then moonlight raced. At others the surroundings were so clear it almost seemed as if by steadying the boat they could leap ashore. And once there happened something that sent a thrill of cold fear through both of them. For where the pool had been, there appeared suddenly a hut, and Toad, standing in the doorway, looking about him, a malicious sneer curving his lips. Jim leapt to his feet, and old Parrish, who had seen Toad too, sprang up in wild excitement.
"Sit down, lad. It's nothing. I turned the micrometer screw a trifle hard. I got us back to 5 years ago when we were living here with Toad. It's just a picture. Get out of the past, Jim."
Jim understood, but he sank down again with cold sweat bathing his forehead. The terrific powers of the Atom Smasher were unveiling themselves more and more each moment. Jim felt Lucille's hand on his arm, and he looked into her face. Jim, darling, what's going to happen to us if Dad can't find out how to work the machine?" "I don't know, dear. I thought that we might all jump out and chance it. If we held each other tight, we'd probably land in the same place. Old Parrish then stood up.
I can't work it, Jim. Toad's got us beat. There's only one thing left for us to do. You can guess what it is.
I think I can, said Jim, glancing askance at Lucille. Yes, he knew, but he lacked the heart to tell her. If we were to all jump out, tied together, don't you think we might land somewhere near where we might want to land?
Jim, do you realize what each vibration of this boat means? There's a table on the instrument board. It's a wavelength of 4,000 miles in space and 19 years in time.
We're moving to London or San Francisco and back?
Further than that, every infinite fraction of a second. No, Jim, we wouldn't land. So we must go back to where we came from. And
he'd been speaking in a low voice calculated not to reach Lucille's ears. The girl had been leaning back, her eyes closed, as if half asleep. And now she rose and stepped up to the two people in front of her. You can tell me the truth. I'm not afraid.
We've got to go back, Lucille. It's our only chance. By following the course in reverse, we can expect to make Atlantis again.
Back to that horrible place?
No, my dear, the chart will lead us obviously back to the cave where Toad has his headquarters. We must try to surprise him and force him to bring us back to Long Island.
And then?
We'll face that problem when we come to it, my dear child.
But how do you expect us to be able to land at the other end any more than this? Suppose the machine continues to vibrate instead of coming to a standstill?
I think that we'll be able to strike a bargain with Toad. Obviously, he'll be willing to bring the machine to a standstill in order to parley with us. We'll make terms the best we can. After all, we can't afford to remain marooned on the island of Atlantis without the Atom Smasher.
I hate the idea of bargaining with that wretch. So do we all, dear, but there's nothing else we can do. It's just a matter of give and take, and I'd be glad to consent to any terms that would bring us three safe back to Earth with all this business behind us.
I'll start back, then,
said Parrish, turning back to the instrument board. And to the familiar thump-thump of the electrical discharge, the Atom Smasher took up its backward journey once more. A long time passed. With her head resting against Jim's chest, Lucille rested. Jim bent over her, trying to discover whether she was asleep or not. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so soft she hardly seemed alive. An infinite pity for the girl filled Jim's heart, and mingled with it the intense determination to overcome the madman who'd subjected her to these perils. He glanced across at Parrish, who was fingering the screws. Old Parrish looked up and nodded. There was a new determination in the old man's face that made him a different person from the crazed old man who Jim had encountered at the vanishing place. We can beat him, Parrish. We're nearly back to the top of the column. Not long afterward, Parrish looked up once more.
Stand by, Jim, and be ready. Toad will be aware of our approach by means of the sensitive instruments he keeps in his laboratory. But don't harm him. We want him aboard, and we want him badly. He won't be able to play any more tricks with us. I've learned too much about the Atom Smasher.
He pressed a lever, and the grayness dissolved into its component parts of light and darkness. A jar, a few thumps, and then the violet light came. Lucille looked up, raised herself, uttered a low cry, and caught at Jim's arm, trembling. They had run their course, truly. The Atom Smasher was vibrating outside the entrance to Toad's cave, and that was Toad standing there, watching them, that devilish grin of his accentuated to the utmost. A blurred figure that appeared and vanished, and a surrounding crowd of Drilgos, how many it was impossible to guess, for they looked like a crowd of apes in motion. Suddenly Toad disappeared, and a moment later Lucille uttered a terrified cry as his voice spoke in her ear.
I thought you'd be back. I knew you'd gotten away from Atlantis when my recorder showed the waves of electrical energy proceeding from the city. You were clever, Dent, but you see, you had to come back to me to get my help.
Don't worry, dear. That's a wireless receiving apparatus. He pointed to a sort of cabinet enclosed among the rotating wheels, and then it was evident that Toad's voice was proceeding from it. Toad's figure appeared again, dancing through a haze of lines and patches. He was holding something in his hand which Jim made out to be the mouthpiece of a microphone. The voice inside the Atom Smasher spoke again. "Turn all the micrometer screws until all the dials register 0, Farish. Then turn dial D to 0.3, dial C to 0.5, dial B to 1, dial A to 2. I'll repeat. Now press the starting lever, Parrish, and you'll find yourself on the firm ground again." A few moments later, the Atom Smasher was pouring out an immense column of the violet light, and slowly the vibration ceased. The blurred forms of Toad and of the Drilgos grew clear. They'd arrived. "And now, my friends, we'll have a talk." "No tricks, Toad. You've probably got a number of deviltries up your sleeve." "1 or 2, Dent." "We're willing to negotiate." "Of course you are. You see, I hold the trumps, Dent. Those dial deflections, which are inevitable in any construction for any piece of mechanism, are not the same for Earth in 1920. Don't think you can use the same figures to land with. You must remember there's been a procession of equinoxes since the time of Atlantis, with a consequent shift in the Earth's axis. No, Dent, I've got you very much where I want you, but I'm willing to discuss terms with you. First of all, let's get rid of this useless cargo. I don't believe in overburdening a ship." He picked up Kane bodily and heaved the astonished Drilgo over the side before he knew what was happening to him. Kane picked himself up and rubbed his sides, whimpering mournfully. The Drilgos crowded closer, their faces agape with astonishment. Oliver Toad spoke a command sharply, and they scattered. "Before we come to terms, Dent, I'll give you a piece of news that may interest you. Much has happened during the time you've been away. Ambassadors have been out to see me from Atlantis. With the aid of a Drilgo interpreter, they conveyed to me that they've been greatly impressed by the disappearance of the Atom Smasher. They have nothing like it, of course, and they think I'm a #1 magician. The upshot is they want me to accept the supreme rule of the city and use my arts to restore the lost territory that's sunk beneath the waves. They swore upon an image of their god, Krook, that they were sincere. I told them I'd sent the Atom Smasher away on a journey, but I'd be back shortly, and that I'd give them their answer. Now, Dent," Toad's face took on that look of fanaticism that Jim had seen on it before, "I'm going to repeat the proposition I made to you before. Join me. I'll make you my chief subordinate, and I'll load you and Parrish down with honors. Everything that a human being can desire shall be yours. And in a year or 2, when we've tired of being gods, we'll take the Atom Smasher back to Earth and destroy it, and with our wealth we'll become the new supreme rulers of Earth, too. I need you, Dent. You don't realize how lonely life can be when you're worshipped as a god. As for Lucille, well, there are 1,000 maidens more beautiful than she is in Atlantis. Come, Dent, your answer. It's your last chance, Dent. Don't throw it away." He read the answer before Jim could speak it. Jim saw Toad's face flicker and hurled himself upon him. Lucille screamed, and the 2 men wrestled together in the narrow confines of the circular boat. Jim struck Toad a blow that sent him reeling against the rail. Then he felt himself seized from behind. A giant Drilgo had him in the arms. He lifted him up over the side and flung him to the earth. In an instant, the chattering Drilgos were crowding down upon him. Struggling madly, Jim saw Toad fell old Parrish with a blow, pushed back Lucille as she sprang at him, and quickly pressed the starting lever. The column of violet fire faded, and there came the whir of the mechanism, and the Atom Smasher vanished. Alright, I'm going to take another real quick break for you to get up and grab some snacks. Feel free to pause the video, get some stretching in. We'll see you here in a moment. I hope everyone had a good little break. Let's get right back into Chapter 9, The Blinded Eye. Jim fought with all his strength. He managed to shake off his assailants and regain his feet. Then one of the Drilgos poised his stone-tipped spear, ready to hurl it through his body. But the spear never left the Drilgo's hand in Jim's direction. Like a great ape, Kane leapt upon the fellow and bore him to the ground, his feet twined around his shoulders, his hands gripping his throat. Not until the Drilgo had been reduced to a heaving, half-strangled hulk did Kane leave him. Then Kane, bending until his stomach almost touched the ground, came worming toward Jim, making signs of obeisance. What had happened that Jim had won the Drilgo's faith? Why did Kane now look upon him apparently as his master? It was impossible to gauge the process of the ancient man's mind, and at the moment Jim was in no mood to wonder. The stunning disaster that had overtaken him monopolized his thoughts. Lucille and Parrish were once more in Toad's power. That was the dominating fact. The only gleam of comfort in the situation was that Toad had given the clue to his movements. Beyond a doubt, Toad had taken his captives into Atlantis with him. It was impossible to disbelieve Toad's statement that he had been offered the supreme power in the city. Toad's egotism would have compelled him to blurt out that fact. Besides, Toad had certainly not gone back to our Earth. It was clear. Jim must force his way into Atlantis. He would find and rescue the two prisoners, or die there. He turned away from the groveling Kane and the chattering Drilgos who, inspired by Kane's example, now seemed animated by the same instinct to obey him, and went into the cave. But at the entrance he turned for a moment and looked back. It was night. The valley was swathed in mists. The volcano opposite was spouting a shaft of lurid fire. On the water was a path of moonlight where the clouds had been dispersed by the Atlanteans. Jim took in the scene, and he raised one arm and shook his fist. Then without a word he passed inside. There was a soft light in the cave, streaming out from an inner chamber, access to which was through a narrow orifice in the rock. Jim passed through and found himself in Toad's laboratory. He was astonished at its completeness, still more so at the existence of numerous pieces of apparatus whose purpose it was difficult to understand. There was a radio transmitter and receiver, but improved out of all recognition from those used in the prosaic year of 1930. 3 or 4 little dynamos, little more than toys in appearance, were generating as much voltage from the indicators as a modern power station. And overhead was a dial, with 2 series of figures in black and red, 2 needles as well, both of which were swinging briskly, indicating that there was an intense electrical disturbance in the vicinity. The Atom Smasher. Jim took heart. Toad couldn't be so far away. He looked about him, subconsciously trying to discover some implement that would prove of service to him, but there was nothing that he could see, not even one of the ray tubes. He looked about uneasily. Then his eyes fell upon something so singularly out of place that it looked for the moment like some prehistoric weapon. It was the last thing Jim would have expected to find here, nothing more or less than a sporting rifle. Deer shooting had been one of Toad's pastimes in the old days, and more than one fat buck had been surreptitiously shot for the benefit of the larder at the vanishing place. There was something almost pathetic in the sight of that rifle and the 50 cartridges in their cardboard carton. Perhaps Toad had pictured himself shooting big game in Atlantis at some period or another. It was a human weakness that for an instant lessened Jim's hate and horror of the man. It brought him to a saner view of the situation. Jim had been on the point of losing his powers of reason, and the sight of the rifle had restored them. He turned sharply as he heard a sound in the entrance. Kane was coming toward him with many genuflections and much stomach wriggling. He stopped and straightened himself, and there was a look of singular intelligence in the Drilgo's face. He began chattering, pointing in the direction of Atlantis, but Jim could make nothing of what he was trying to convey. "Yes, they're there, but I don't see that's going to help me."
"Oh, my poor Lucille,"
said Kane unexpectedly. The words were like a parrot's speech, the intonation so remarkable, a copy of old Parrish's, that Jim was flabbergasted. And nevertheless, it was evident that Kane knew he was referring to Lucille. With a strange, slinking motion, he crossed the laboratory and bent beneath a great slab of stone that was resting on 2 great hewn rocks. He emerged, holding in his arms 2 curious contrivances, and he laid them at Jim's feet. Jim stared at them, and suddenly understood what they were. They were two pairs of wings of the kind that the Atlanteans had used when they made their aerial sortie against the Drilgos. Kye picked up one pair and began adjusting it about his body. He made fluttering movements with his arms. You mean to say you've learned how to fly? And Kye, as if understanding, nodded and beamed all over his face. With that, Jim's idea was born. If the Drilgos would follow him, he'd lead them against Atlantis. And before the assault began, he'd fly to the great eye that guarded it and blind it. He thought afterward that it was like a supernatural revelation, this scheme that had jumped full-fledged into his brain. And Kye had developed extraordinary executive ability. Outside the cave, through rifts in the swirls of fog, Jim could see innumerable Drilgos massing in the valley, as if they understood Jim's purpose. From Kye's gesticulations and the number of times he rubbed his stomach, it was evident that he counted upon sacking Atlantis, and was imagining innumerable meals of fat captives. Each flash of lurid light from the volcano disclosed further masses of Drilgos, armed with their stone spears, apparently assembling for the attack. Whether Toad had summoned them before the Atlanteans offered him the rulership of the city, or whether Jim's own plan had been communicated by some telepathic process, it was impossible to guess, but there was not the least doubt that they were prepared to follow him. Kye nudged Jim and began strapping the other pair of wings about his body. Jim saw that the energy was supplied by two tiny lights burning in the base. Cold fire, stored energy by whose strength he couldn't guess. However, when Kye took him by the hand and motioned him to slide a knob in the groove, he was hurled skyward like a rocket. There followed a delirious hour, tossing and tumbling like a pigeon in a gale. Jim, by degrees, acquired mastery over the apparatus. By the end of the hour, he could fly almost as well as Kye, who, like a guardian angel, kept beside him, reaching out a hand when he overbalanced and pulling him out of aerial side slips. Suddenly, Kye motioned toward the volcano and started toward it in a rocket-like swoop. Jim understood. The Drilgos were ready for attack upon Atlantis. Jim dropped to earth, ran back into the cave, and picked up the rifle and carton of ammunition. He filled the magazine, and with the rifle on his arm, rose into the air again. Kye was circling back, uttering weird cries of distress at finding his master absent. "It's all right, Kye. I'm right here." Side by side, they flew steadily toward the base of the great cone, which was pouring out a fan-shaped stream of fire. Rumbling shook the earth. It was evident that another upheaval was in the course of preparation. The long column of Drilgos could be seen, extending around the flank of a mountain. And then of a sudden, the eye opened, and across the causeway came the blue-white ray, carrying death and destruction. The Drilgos had learned their lesson, and remained concealed out of the ray's path, escaping, but a great dinosaur, 50 or 60 feet in length, startled by the light, came blundering out of the ferns, uttered a bellow, and melted into an amorphous mass. Birds dropped from their roosting places with a sound like that of falling hail, and black paths were cloven through the midst of the jungle. Rifle in hand, Jim soared into the air and shot forward, high above the causeway toward the towering eye. He had noticed that the blue-white ray appeared in cycles of about 2 minutes, and made his plans accordingly. 2 minutes in which to accomplish his task, or take the chance of a hideous death. Some 30 seconds carried him right into the glowing heart of the winking eye, and there he hovered and raised his rifle. Underneath him the breakers thundered. Round the eye a myriad seabirds fluttered, dashing themselves against it and falling into the waves. Huge and high, the great city towered into the skies, lit by its soft incandescence. Jim could see the throngs in the streets, the traffic, but what was happening on the other side of the eye? Suddenly he saw the moon in her third quarter sailing through the skies, and a hideous fear overcame him. Suppose Toad had met with treachery. Suppose that this very night Lucille was doomed to be sacrificed to the terrible god Kruk. Suppose that even at this moment her tender flesh were being sacrificed by the awful hooks. He drew a bead upon the eye and fired, and yet he missed. The bullet went wide, but even if it struck, what guarantee had he that it would shatter the glass, or whatever substance it was that covered the orb? He lost position and knew that the 2-minute interval was drawing to a close. He soared and fired again, and yet the eye still glowed. And then a blinding ray shot forth from it, so dazzling it seemed to sear Jim's eyeballs. The interval had ended. It shot beneath him, but no more than a few feet, and turning his eyes shoreward, he saw it sweep along the causeway and tear a black path through the forest. Frantically he soared and circled around the temple. The ray went out. 2 minutes more passed. And now the temporary panic had passed. Jim's nerves grew steady as a rock. He eased the controls and floated in toward the glowing orb. Sea mews, screaming, dashed themselves against it and fell, wounded and broken into the breaking seas below. They fluttered past Jim's face. One impacted against his chest with a thud that rocked him where he hovered. But Jim knew that he couldn't fail. At a distance of 50 feet, he drew a bead upon the center of the eye and pressed the trigger, and instantly the light went out. Chapter 10. The Fight in the Dark. He dropped down softly to the causeway. Within the city, he heard a sound such as he'd never heard before, as if some ancient prophecy of doom had been fulfilled. A wailing, "Hi-yah! Hi-yah! Hi-yah!" It was caught up from throat to throat, and rose upon the wind in a clamor wild and mournful, as that of the seabirds around the broken eye. It was the death caning of proud Atlantis, queen of the Atlantic for 50,000 years. She was dying in darkness, for with the blinding of the eye all the soft lights within the city had gone out. Dense, utter, impenetrable darkness reigned, and even the gibbous moon floating overhead seemed to give no light. Jim dropped to the causeway and began running in the direction of the city, but, feeling the drag of his wings, he unbuckled the strap and flung them away. He might need them, but his one thought was to get to Lucille, if she were still alive, and he felt that each moment lost might mean he would be too late. Through the blackness he raced forward, hearing that sobbing ululation between the walls. But behind him he heard another sound and shuddered at it. All his hopes suddenly reversed. That sound was the shouting of the Drilgos as they rushed forward to conquest. And now it seemed a monstrous thing that proud Atlantis should be at mercy of these hordes. He had let loose destruction upon the world, but it was to save Lucille. That was his consolation. And yet he hardly checked the racing thoughts within his mind, even for a moment, to meditate on what he'd done. Those thoughts were all of Lucille. He must get to her before the Drilgos entered, and he ran faster, panting, gasping, till of a sudden the portal loomed before him, and he saw a crowd of frenzied Atlanteans struggling to pass through, and a file of soldiers struggling to keep them back. He could distinguish nothing more than the confused struggle. He hurled himself into the midst of the crowd and swept it back. He was within the walls now, and struggling to pass through the mob of people that was swarming like homeless bees. He fought them with flailing fist, and he clove a pathway through them, until he found himself in a great shadowy space that he recognized as the central assembly of the city. More by instinct than design, he hit upon the narrow court that was the elevator. But the court was filled with another mob of struggling people, and in the darkness there was no possibility of discovering the secret of raising it. He blundered about, raging, forcing a path now here, now there. He ran into blind alleys, into small, threading streets about the court, which led him into the central palace of assembly. It was like a nightmare, that blind search under the pale 3/4 moon and the black, star-blotched sky. Suddenly Jim found himself wedged by the pressure of the crowd into a sort of recess, leading off the elevator court. So strong was the pressure here that he was unable to move an inch. Wedged bolt upright, he could only wait and let the frenzied mob stream past him. And louder above the sound of wailing came the roars of the Drilgos swarming along the causeway. Suddenly something gave behind him. It seemed like a door, but it was broken off its hinges by the mob pressure. Joe was hurled backward and fell heavily down a flight of stone stairs, bringing him up against a stone balustrade. He got up, unconscious of his bruises, and ran to the top of the flight. and saw the dim square of palest twilight where the door had been. But over him he could faintly see the stars in the balustrade, winding away to what seemed to be an immeasurable height. That stairway must lead to the top of the building, and thence there should be access to the amphitheater. Jim turned to it, but suddenly a tremendous uproar filled the streets, the yells and clicking grunts of the Drilgos, the screams of the panic-stricken populace. The invaders had arrived, and they were sweeping all before them. No chance of recognition in that darkness. "Lucille!" Shouting her name, Jim began to ascend the stairs in leaps of 3 at a time. But long before he reached the top, he was ascending one by one, with straining limbs and laboring breath. Red slaughter down below, a very inferno of sound, above that shadowy stairway, still extending almost to the heavens, step after step, flight after flight. Jim's lungs were bursting and his heart hammering as if it would break its chest. One flight more, one more, another. Suddenly he realized that his task had ended. In place of stairs stood a vast hall, and beyond that another hall, dim in the faint light that filtered through the glass above. Jim thought he remembered where he was. Beyond the next hall there should be the tongue of flooring, crossing the amphitheater and joining the platform of the idols. But he stopped suddenly as he emerged, not upon the tongue, but upon still another stairway. He had gone astray, and out of his bursting lungs a cry of rage and despair went up. For a moment he stood still. What use was there in proceeding further? And then amazingly there came what might have been a sign from heaven. Down through a small, square opening overhead, no larger than a ventilator, it came. A glimmer of violet flame. And Jim hurled himself like a madman against the stairs, and surmounted them with two bounds. There were no more. Instead, Jim found himself looking down into the amphitheater. The thick walls had cut off all sound from his ears, save a confused murmur, but now a hideous uproar assailed them. The whole floor of the amphitheater was a mass of moving shadows of slaying and slain. The Drilgos had broken in and trapped the multitudes that had taken refuge there. Their fearful stone-tipped spears thrust in and out, to the accompaniment of their savage howls and the screams of the dying. Never has such a shadow play been seen, perhaps, as that below, where death stalked in dense darkness, and the slayer didn't even see his victim. Only the thrust of the spears, the soft, yielding flesh that they encountered, the scream, the wrench of stone from tissue, and the blended howl of triumph and scream of despair. And yet only for a moment did Jim turn his eyes upon that sight, for he knew where he was now. He had emerged upon the other side of the amphitheater, upon the platform where he had seen the priests and dignitaries gathered when he was led forward to be sacrificed. There in the rear were hideous, shadowy gods, looming up out of the darkness, their outstretched arms interlaced. And there upon the platform was the atom smasher, a little thread of violet light seeping out of the central tube. And beside it stood a group of figures impossible to distinguish in the darkness, but of a sudden Lucille's scream rang out in the din below. With 3 leaps, Jim was at her side. He saw the girl, Todd and Parrish, struggling in the grasp of a dozen priests. They were dragging them toward the idols, and Jim understood what that scene portended. In despair at the interruption of the Drilgos, the priests were seeking to propitiate their gods by sacrificing the 3 strangers whom they held responsible for all their woes. Jim caught Lucille in his arms, shouting her name. She knew him and turned toward him. Then one of the priests, armed with a great stone-headed club, for no metal is permitted within the precincts of the god Kruk, struck at him furiously. Jim leapt aside, letting the club descend harmlessly upon the floor. He shot out with his right, and all of his strength behind it, catching the priest upon the jaw, and the man crumpled. Whirling the club about his head, he fought back the fanatics, all the while shouting to Toad to start the atom smasher. In such a moment he only remembered that Toad was a man of his own generation. He struck down 3 of the priests, and then he was seized around the knees from behind, and he fell heavily. The club was wrenched from his hand. In another moment, Jim found himself helpless in the grasp of the Atlanteans. As he stopped struggling for a moment to gather his strength for a supreme effort, he heard a whir overhead, and saw that the arms of the stone gods were beginning their terrible revolution. The priests had started the machinery, and high above the din rang out the wild chant of the high priest. Jim saw him now, a figure poised upon a platform behind the arms, his own arms raised heavenward. Ayah! 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 Jim was being dragged forward, with Lucille beside him, and old Parrish following, still making a futile struggle for life while pitiful screeches issued from his mouth. Jim saw the revolving arms descend within a foot of his head. One more fight. One more, the last. And then just as suddenly, with loud yells, a band of Drilgos leapt forward from the head of the stairs and rushed upon the struggling priests and their victims. And dark as it was, Jim recognized their leader, Kye. And Kye knew Lucille. As the priests rallied for a desperate resistance, Kye hurled his body through the air, landing squarely upon the shoulders of the priest nearest the revolving arms and knocking him flat. Then the arms caught flesh of priest and Drilgo, and the steel hooks dug deep. A screech of terror, a howl that reverberated through the amphitheater, and nothing remained of either but a heap of macerated flesh. But in that instant, Jim had fought free again. He caught Lucille and dragged her back toward the Atom Smasher. Toad had already broken from his captors and was working at it frantically.
Hold on! Hold on!
They had a moment's leeway. The Drilgos had driven the priests back into the hooks, and with awful shrieks the fanatics were yielding up their lives in place of their selected victims. But more Drilgos were pouring up the stairs. A moment's leeway and no more, before the savage band would impale the 4 upon their stone-pointed spears. There was not the slightest chance they could make their identity known. "For heaven's sake, hurry!" Jim yelled in Toad's ear. The wheels were revolving. There was a stream of violet light leaping out of the central tunnel, and it cast a lurid illumination upon the scene. But it was too late. A score of Drilgos with leveled spears were rushing on the 4.
Hold tight!
He thrust his arm into his chest and pulled out a little lever. Jim recognized it and remembered. It was the instrument of universal death, the uranium release of untold forces of cataclysmic depredation.
"Take that!"
screamed the old man, inserting the lever into the secret groove in the Atom Smasher and jerking it in the direction of the priests. Chapter 11. Toad's Last Gamble. A roar that seemed to rend the heavens followed, roar upon roar, as the infinite momentum of the disintegrating uranium struck obstacle after obstacle. The Drilgos vanished, the amphitheater melted away, the walls and roof. Overhead were the moon and stars. And proud Atlantis was sinking into the depths of the sea. Not as a ship sinks, but piecemeal, her walls and towers crumbling and toppling as a child's sand castle crumbles under the attack of a lapping wave. Down they crashed, carrying their freight of black, clinging human ants, while from the sea's depths a wave, a mile high, rose and battered the fragments to destruction. From the crater of the volcano a huge wave of fire fanned upward, and where fire and water met, a cloud of steam rose up. A boiling chaos in which water and earth and fire were blended spread over land and sea, and then suddenly it was ended. Where the last island of the Atlantean continent had been, only the ocean was to be seen, placid beneath the stars. The Atom Smasher was vibrating at a tremendous speed. Jim, with one arm around Lucille, faced Toad at the instrument board, and nearby sat Parrish, watching him too.
"That took a whole year. that pretty little scene of destruction we've just witnessed. The good old Atom Smasher has been doing some lively stunts, so we'd been engulfed too. We're not likely to see anything so pretty in history again unless we go to watch the destruction of Herculaneum and Pompeii by lava from Vesuvius, but that would be right. That would be rather tame in comparison with this. Toad's jeering tone grated on Jim's ears immeasurably. I don't think any of us are craving any more experience, Toad, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Suppose you take us back to Peconic Bay. We'll dump the Atom Smasher into a pond and try to forget that we've had anything except a bad nightmare. Don't trust him, Jim. Thank you, Toad answered, scowling. But seriously, Dent, we can't go back with nothing to show for all our trouble. Those fools tried to betray me, and then the eye went out. Perhaps I have you to thank for that performance. However, the sensible thing is to let bygones be bygones. But we must make a little excursion. How about picking up a little treasure from the hordes of Solomon or Genghis Khan? A few pounds of precious stones would make a world of difference in our social status when we reach Long Island. Jim felt a cold fury permeating him, and Toad saw his grim look and laughed malignantly. Well, Dent, I'm ready to be frank with you. The game's still in my hands, you see. I want Lucille. I'm willing to take you and Paris back, provided you agree she'll be mine. I'll have to trust you, but I shall have means of evening up if you play crooked. Why don't you ask my girl herself? He needn't trouble. He knows the answer. There's your answer. Now what's the alternative? The alternative is I've already set the dial to eternity, Dent. Eternity in the fifth dimension. Didn't know I'd work that out, had you? A little pleasant surprise. No, don't try to move. My hand is on the lever. I have only to press it and we're there. Jim stood stock still in horror. Toad's voice rang true, and he believed Toad had the power he claimed. Yes, the fifth dimension in eternity, where time and space reel into functionlessness. Don't ask me what it's like there. I've never been, but my impression of it is a fairly good representation of the place popularly known as Hell. You fool. You fool, Dent. I gave you your chance to come in with me. Together we'd made ourselves masters of Atlantis and brought our plunder back to our 20th century world, but you refused because of a girl, Dent, who loved me long before you came upon the scene. That's a lie, Lucius, and you can do your worst. That's one factor you haven't reckoned in your calculations, and that's God. The dark blur on the spectral lines. Come on, make your choice, Dent. It's merely to press this lever, you'll find yourself well. We won't go into that. I don't know where you'll find yourself. You'll disappear, but so shall I. But I'm desperate. I must have Lucille. Choose. Choose all of you. Lucille has answered you. And how about you, old man? Go to your own hell, you devil. A blinding light, a frantic oscillation of the Atom Smasher, a sense of death, awful and indescribable, and stark unconsciousness rushed over Jim. His last thought that was Lucille's arms were about him and that he was holding her. Nothing mattered. Therefore, even though they too were plunged into that awful nothingness of the fifth dimension, where neither space nor time recognizably exists, love could exist there. Chapter 12, Solid Earth. He's coming around, Lucille. Thank God for it. Jim opened his eyes. For a few moments he looked about him without understanding. Then the outlines of a room etched themselves against a clouded background. And in the foreground, Lucille's face. The girl was bending over Jim, one hand soothing his forehead. Where am I? Back on Earth, Jim, the good old Earth, never to leave it, answered Lucille with a catch in her voice. With a moment's effort she composed herself. You mustn't talk. But what place is this? It's Sandy Loom's house. Now rest, and I'll explain everything later. But the first explanation came from Loom himself.
Well, Mr. Dent. My wife and me sure were glad to be on the spot when you and Miss Parrish got bogged on the edge of that black pool. Mean treacherous place it is. There's a cow got mired in there last month up to her belly. If we hadn't found her and dragged her out with the rope, she'd gone clear under. Grandpop Dawes says that there's underground strings around the edge that run straight down to hell. It seems sort of far-fetched to me.
Yes, sir, and I hadn't heard WNYC giving Mrs. Parrish on the list of missing persons that never been seen near here. I reckon I never found her. It made me and my wife out uneasy that did. Nandy, I got Nickel and you ought to go to the vanishing place and see if she ain't there, she says. And there I found you two mired to the waist in the Paris dance around fretting clothes, burning as sinners. It sure seems same to me to think if Mr. Paris got away safe after that explosion 5 years ago, just wandering around with last memory, and to found him and bring him back here. There's strange things in the world, that surely is.
But in the happiness of being back on Earth once more, Jim was content to let any further explanation go. The return of Parrish had been duly chronicled in the newspapers and provoked a mild interest, but fortunately the public mind was so occupied at the moment with the trial of a nightclub hostess that after the first rush of newspapermen, the three were left alone. Day after day, in the brilliant autumn weather, Jim and Lucille would roam the tinted woods, recharging themselves with a feel of earth until the memory of those dread experiences grew dim.
Well, Jim, I reckon I'd better tell you and get it over with,
said old Parrish one morning. Parrish quite his old jaunty self again.
Toad had got the dials pointing to fifth dimension eternity, like he said, though it's actually, I believe it's nothing more than annihilation, a grand smash. Well, he did press that lever, but something gone wrong. You remember how poor Kye seemed to take great interest in the atom smasher. There's no way of telling what had been going on in that brain of his, but it looks to me he'd known that lever meant death. It was sealed up in wax, and Toad had got it free on the way out of Atlantis. Well, this is what I'd made out from examining the thing afterward. Kye had been monkeying with the lever. He pried loose one of the wires that hooked to the transformer and short-circuited it, not knowing, of course, what he was doing. The result was when Toad pressed the lever, instead of blowing the whole contraption to pieces, he got a couple billion volts of electricity through his body, combined with a larger amperage than had ever been imagined. It burned him to a few grease spots. He simply vanished. You don't remember what you did at the moment, boy?
I don't seem to remember anything.
Well, your response was an automatic one. You jumped him. Luckily, you were too late. Toad vanished just like that. But you must have gotten to that field of magnetic force. Anyway, you almost got electrocuted. Lucille and I thought you were dead for hours. We laid you down and set a course for home. I used those dial numberings Toad had given me. He said they wouldn't work, but he'd lied. They worked. They brought us back to the vanishing place. We carried you out, and I saw your eyelid switch. We worked over you with artificial respiration. Looked like there was a chance for you. I shut off the power and let the water rush in over the atom smasher and ran ashore. There it lies at the bottom of the pool. Hopefully it lies there till Judgment Day.
Toad was a genius, but he never understood that character counts for more than genius. Let's think no more about him, said Lucille. She'd come up to them, and the two looked at each other and smiled. Love is self-centered. Other things it forgets very quickly. Tomorrow we go back to New York. You think you're able to face the world and take up life again?
I think so, Jim.
You're not remembering him after all.
No, Jim, I was thinking of poor Kye. He died for my sake.
That was 12,000 years ago, my dear. And today's today. And tomorrow a new life begins for you and me. He drew her closer to him. No, he'd never quite forget. But that was 12,000 years ago. And tomorrow was his wedding day.
Wasn't that something? Wasn't that a great story? That's wonderful. It's a good time.
But anyway, that was the final story of the May issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science. The Atom Smasher. It was pretty good. I think it's a good time. So with that, we have, let's see here, we have May done and over with. So we got June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Now, I'm going to be straight with y'all. I have all these issues, but I've found that a lot of what gets watch time is when I actually read, established classics, stuff like you might have to read in a literature class. So, and there's plenty of that's in the public domain that I could do. So, go ahead and leave a comment down below whether you want more. I might even leave a link down in the description to a poll of some kind. Maybe I'll even put an iCard if I'm that lucid. To find out, would you guys rather established classics or do you want more astounding stories? I'd prefer just let me know in the comments. I know that we're going to get to established classics after Astounding Stories if we keep going with Astounding Stories. But if you'd prefer them first, we can just keep Astounding Stories, in our pocket. Or I could just read Astounding Stories on my own darn time. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what y'all think about it. But anyway, it's about all the time I have for paper cuts. So, thanks for tuning in, folks. It's been a good couple hours reading with y'all. Next time, we'll probably be back with the June issue of Astounding Stories. This has been Paper Cuts, and I sure hope it didn't sting.